If you ever want to know how far modern medicine has drifted from its roots, just picture the average clinic waiting room, fluorescent lights, beige chairs, and a stack of leaflets warning you that you might die of something you can't pronounce. Now contrast that with the old healing lodges of the Americas, low, circular, dimly lit by fire, smelling of cedar and damp earth. No one handed you a clipboard there. Someone sang instead. Healing, for most native nations, wasn't an act you performed on a body. It was a negotiation with the universe. Illness meant something was out of balance: spirit, emotion, weather, sometimes your attitude toward your grandmother. And instead of prescribing pills, the healer adjusted reality itself, using herbs, smoke, prayer, and an unnerving level of calm. There were no spectators. Everyone present had a role. Someone tended the fire, someone ground roots, someone drummed until the air itself began to hum like an approaching storm. Ceremony was the real hospital. You didn't go there for quick fixes. You went to remember how to exist correctly. The Lakota called it warheki, prayer as alignment. The Dain understood sickness as disorder, which could be coaxed back into harmony through the chantway, a ritual lasting days, involving sand paintings so precise they could make geometry professors cry. Even the medicine man wasn't just a doctor. He was an architect of equilibrium, making sure the human and the non-human didn't start passive-aggressively rearranging each other's furniture again. Modern anthropology often insists on sorting these practices into spiritual and medical, as though people once scheduled those separately. But to the communities themselves, the categories never existed. The chant that called back a person's soul after trauma wasn't symbolic. It was therapy, chemistry, and theology wrapped into one melodic system. You didn't just hear the song, you inhaled it, like penicillin with better acoustics. And yes, plants were part of it, but not the silent, potted variety modern wellness influencers pose with. These were personalities. Sage didn't merely smell nice. It escorted bad energies out, like a polite but firm bouncer. Cedar smoked through the room like an ancient disinfectant. Tobacco carried prayers into the wind, and sweetgrass was the one that made even spirits lean in for a sniff. Together, they were the four sacred medicines, the herbal equivalent of a perfectly balanced chemical equation. Each region had its own additions, its own recipes whispered under the crackle of fire. And before colonization brought pharmacies and epidemics in the same wagon, these medicines worked. Willow bark for pain, same salicylates as aspirin. Bearberry for urinary infections packed with antiseptics. Yarrow to stop bleeding. Golden seal to sterilize wounds. The point wasn't just to heal the body, but to remind the body it still belonged to the world. Even the act of making medicine was medicine. Grinding roots wasn't busywork. It was meditation disguised as manual labor. People talked to the plants, apologized for cutting them, thanked them for their cooperation. Imagine that: modern pharmaceutical companies sending flowers, an apology note after harvest season. The old healers would have laughed themselves breathless. There's something haunting about how every herb, every chant, every swirl of clay carried the same message. You are not alone in your illness. The earth is also trying to fix you. The irony is that today, after a few centuries of dismissing these methods as superstition, we're back to rediscovering them in clinical trials and wellness blogs, as if they'd been waiting patiently in the soil, muttering, "Took you long enough." Some of those medicines were plants, others were stones, and one of the most revealing was the simplest leaf burned for clarity, a smoke that both cleansed and connected. Among the many strange things modern people do for comfort, like sleeping beside phones or buying scented candles that smell like ocean memory, none quite compares to the ancient genius of burning plants to fix the air. Long before air purifiers and spa playlists, indigenous nations across North America were already professionals at turning smoke into therapy. They called it balance. We'd probably call it aromatherapy and sell it for $40 a bundle. The four sacred medicines, tobacco, sage, cedar, and sweetgrass, weren't just plants you lit because they smelled good. They were the backbone of an entire cosmology, a green quartet with divine job descriptions. Tobacco carried words to the sky. Sage swept away the spiritual dust. Cedar guarded the boundaries, and sweetgrass invited the good ones back in, smelling like sunlight braided into hay. You didn't use them lightly. You approached them like old relatives, respectfully, cautiously, knowing they had opinions. Tobacco came first. Sacred tobacco wasn't the industrial leaf that kills you on a lunch break. It was a bridge. When smoke curled upward from the bowl, it carried prayers, promises, and, occasionally, apologies. Healers used it as an offering before gathering other plants, asking permission from the forest, as if applying for a very serious permit. Its potency wasn't in the nicotine, it was in the contract between breath and wind. Every puff was a handshake with the unseen. Sage was the cleaner of spaces, the disinfectant of both germs and bad vibes. There are over a dozen native varieties, white, black, desert, prairie, but all shared the same unspoken command: clear it out. When burned, the smoke released thujin and camphor compounds, which modern lab tests confirm do, in fact, kill bacteria. The ancestors didn't need peer review. They had noses and centuries of proof. You smudged yourself before ceremonies, before childbirth, before gossip spiraled into curses. It wasn't superstition, it was hygiene, spiritual and literal. Cedar was the quiet guardian, used in winter lodges and sweat ceremonies. It smoked thicker, its scent heavier. The Ojibwe still hang cedar boughs above doors to block negative spirits or, more practically, mosquitoes. It was boiled for fevers, ground into poultices, steeped into tea that tasted like forest memories. Cedar reminded people that protection wasn't always a shield. Sometimes it was the smell of your grandmother's house when you walked in from the snow. Then came sweetgrass, the most deceptive of them all. Soft, fragrant, harmless looking, but when braided and burned, it transformed the room. Its smoke was said to attract kindness, like an open window for good spirits. Sweetgrass smelled of warmth, the kind of sweetness that arrives only after fire. Chemists today would call its key compound coumarin, the same thing used in perfumes. Indigenous healers called it love. Together, the four medicines worked as a cycle: cleanse, guard, connect, invite. You could spend your life studying their chemistry and still miss the point. The genius wasn't just the pharmacology, was the choreography. Burn this before that, say the prayer in the right direction, thank the plant when it's done. The ritual was the real prescription. The smoke was just the delivery system. It's a kind of irony that now, in the age of disinfectant sprays and motivational podcasts, humanity is rediscovering the idea that space itself holds mood, and that cleaning it might start with a little smoke and sincerity. But for the old healers, that was just housekeeping. The serious medicine was still in the roots, waiting patiently underground. And some of those roots, when dug up, brewed, and swallowed, could fight pain better than anything found in a plastic bottle. Every civilization eventually invents caffeine and regret. Europe had coffee, China had tea. The indigenous Southeast had something stronger, darker, and slightly terrifying: yopenhali. It grew thick along the coastal plains, small shiny leaves hiding the kind of alkaloid that could make a hunter feel like he could argue with thunder. The plant's Latin name, Ilex vomitoria, is an unfortunate bit of colonial sarcasm. European botanists saw how southeastern tribes drank it ceremonially, then purged and assumed it was just nature's emetic party trick. In truth, it wasn't about the vomiting, it was about purification. The purge was symbolic, spiritual, and sometimes literal. Yes, but it was the kind of literal you planned for. Warriors of the Creek, Choctaw, and Cherokee would gather before hunts or councils, drink the black drink in great gulps, and cleanse themselves of whatever might interfere with clear judgment, fear, anger, or last night's bad fish. The irony: the same Europeans who named it vomitoria later realized it contained the only native caffeine source north of the tropics. A stimulant tea made from leaves roasted over fire, tasting halfway between green tea and burnt honesty. It sharpened the senses, quickened the pulse, and, according to 17th century accounts, produced serenity, which is impressive for something that came with a side effect of projectile enlightenment. What's even stranger is how methodical the ritual was. Only men of status were allowed to drink it during councils. Women prepared it but didn't partake. The leaves were steeped in large shell cups, and as the steam rose, chants began, monotone, rhythmic, designed to open the body to clarity. This was pharmacology with choreography. Each gulp was taken with a prayer, each purge seen as expelling not sickness but corruption. You could almost call it the world's first detox cleanse, except this one worked and didn't involve Instagram. Chemically, yopen is fascinating. Its caffeine content rivals coffee, but it also carries theobromine, the feel-good molecule in chocolate which, explains why the drink left people both alert and weirdly euphoric. Modern studies confirm its antioxidant profile and low acidity, yet for centuries it was dismissed, forgotten, or reduced to a botanical joke. Americans imported tea from across oceans, while an entire native caffeine economy with ritual depth grew wild in their backyards. Some anthropologists have suggested that the ritual vomiting wasn't even universal. Among the Timucua and Gwali, it was more symbolic. They drank to speak truthfully before councils, not to clean intestines. The black drink was as much a legal serum as it was a beverage truth, through chemistry. There's something poetic in that. A culture where honesty required a stimulant. When colonists finally tried it, most couldn't handle the bitterness or the ceremony. They preferred their stimulants divorced from spirituality and served in porcelain. The irony is that Yopan holly still grows everywhere in the American South hedges, gardens, sidewalks, its leaves quietly photosynthesizing caffeine, waiting for someone to remember what they used to mean. In a way, it's the perfect symbol of forgotten medicine. Potent, practical, slightly misunderstood, and buried under centuries of condescension. But while Yopan was the morning cure for the soul, the desert had its own kind of therapy, one that smelled of tar, smoke, and sunlight baked into thorns. If Yopan was the polite conversation starter of indigenous medicine, chaparral was the cranky dessert uncle who healed you while insulting your life choices. It grows across the American Southwest, stretching into Mexico, an evergreen shrub that smells like rain hitting hot pavement and tastes like someone boiled a tire for your benefit. Yet, despite that, it was once one of the most respected medicines of the desert peoples. The Navajo, Pima, and Seri all used it, and for good reason. Every part of the plant has opinions. The leaves exude resin laced with nordihydraguaric acid and DGA. If you don't want to bite your tongue, which modern scientists later found to be a powerful antioxidant and antimicrobial, long before anyone could pronounce it, healers used the same sticky resin to pack wounds, treat infections, soothe arthritis, and somehow cure hangovers. If nature has a pharmacy, chaparral was the aisle-marked miracle with side effects. Its smell, sharp and tar-like, was said to chase away sickness. Burned as a smoke or brewed into tea, it acted as a cleanser for both lungs and spirit. Desert communities didn't waste anything. You could chew the leaves for colds, rub the sap on sores, or soak your feet in it after a long day walking on ground that could fry an egg. The plant was medicine, deodorant, antiseptic, and desert gossip all in one. Spanish chroniclers noted its use as early as the 1600s, watching indigenous healers apply it to wounds and fevers. They assumed it was witchcraft, probably because it worked. Later settlers called it greasewood and dismissed it as a weed, right up until they realized the same weed could stop bacterial infections and slow tumor growth. The U.S. National Cancer Institute even studied NDGA in the 20th century before shelving it because of toxicity in concentrated doses. Translation: it was too strong for people who think aspirin is spicy. But traditional healers never drank it by the pint. They respected it. Medicine in the desert wasn't about greed, it was about moderation. One leaf too many and your stomach would file a complaint. Used properly, chaparral cooled fevers, soothed sore throats, and disinfected wounds faster than anything that came in a tin box. Some tribes even used it ceremonially, burning it for protection or sprinkling its ash over the sick to dry out the bad spirit. There's a strange beauty in how such a bitter plant could be used so tenderly. The desert doesn't give gifts easily. It hands you survival lessons disguised as thorns. To heal with chaparral, you had to understand that pain itself was part of the treatment. A tea so bitter it made your ancestors wince meant the medicine was working. Today, health stores occasionally resurrect it under names like creosote detox, selling capsules that promise longevity and enlightenment. The irony is that the people who once used it for centuries never called it cleansing. They called it balance. They didn't drink it to feel pure. They drank it because someone's child had a fever, or because the wind had brought too many flies, or because the world felt off-kilter, and the earth was offering a correction. And once the bitterness faded, something else emerged to clarity that belonged to high deserts and silent mornings. But chaparral wasn't the only root that spoke in strange tongues. Up in the mountains, another medicine waited, one carried by bears and whispered by snowmelt. Some medicines don't need marketing, they have bears. Osha, or bear root, earned its name because grizzlies were spotted digging it up. chewing the roots, then rubbing themselves against the plants like massive, furry pharmacists. For the indigenous peoples of the Rocky Mountains and the Southwest, the Apache, Dine, Ute, and Zuni, this wasn't a cute wildlife anecdote. It was evidence. If the strongest creature in the forest trusted a root to fight infection, who was going to argue? The plant itself doesn't look particularly divine. A humble member of the carrot family, with feathered leaves and clusters of white flowers that look like they've seen too much weather. But underground, it hides a dark resinous root with the smell of spicy celery and the temperament of a stubborn healer. The Ute chewed it for sore throats. The Navajo brewed it into tea for fevers, coughs, and snake bites. Midwives steeped it to ease childbirth. You could almost say Osha was the aspirin of the highlands, if aspirin could also exorcise bad dreams. Chemically, it's a wonder packed with ligustolide and ferulic acid, compounds with antiviral and anti-inflammatory effects. Modern lab studies confirm that Osha inhibits bacteria like Streptococcus and E. coli, the same ones that keep pharmaceutical companies in business. But centuries before any microscope, healers knew it simply as the breath medicine. Osha was used to strengthen lungs, protect against altitude sickness, and ward off the invisible things that make your chest heavy when the wind shifts and the spirits get restless. You didn't just pick Osha, though you introduced yourself to it. You left an offering, tobacco or cornmeal, and waited until the air felt right. Taking from the earth without ceremony was considered theft, and theft was bad for the immune system. When you finally dug it up, the smell filled the air like old spice and wet stoner scent, so strong it lingered in clothing, tools, even the hands that touched it. Hunters carried pieces of the root for luck and protection. Mothers tucked it under infants' cradles to keep nightmares away. In the old stories, the bears taught people how to use it. That detail isn't symbolic, it's ethnobiology wrapped in myth. Bears are omnivores with a decent grasp of pharmacology. They'll seek out Osha in spring when their digestion needs a reboot. The tribes simply observed and took notes, proving that the first clinical trials didn't happen in labs but in forests, with participants who growled. What's fascinating is how Osha still sits on the border between science and spirit. Some herbalists call it the root of protection, others, the medicine of courage. Its bitter taste is said to sharpen awareness, grounding the body in the present, an ancient version of mindfulness with better flavor. In many Pueblo and Dine ceremonies, Osha smoke still rises during healing chants, thick and sweet, carrying prayers to the mountain air. Of course, modern regulation doesn't love wild Osha. It's been over-harvested, traded online, and nearly commodified into extinction. The elders warn against this. When medicine becomes profit, the earth starts charging interest. But up there, above the tree line, it still grows quietly between rocks, stubborn as ever, reminding anyone who finds it that healing was never meant to be convenient. And just below those mountains, across the plains and river valleys, another kind of medicine was at work, less dramatic, maybe, but equally persistent. Small, humble herbs that cured fevers, soothed wounds, and looked like weeds to everyone who didn't know better. Every culture has its unsung heroes, the quiet types who don't make headlines but keep civilization from collapsing in between catastrophes. In the botanical world of indigenous medicine, Prunella vulgaris was exactly that, known as self-heal. It grew wherever people walked, settled, or accidentally dropped a seed. It didn't look noble. Small purple flowers, low to the ground, the kind of plant you'd step on without noticing. But healers noticed. They always noticed the ones trying their best in silence. Across the Pacific Northwest, and well into the Great Plains, self-heal was the reliable friend for minor disasters, cuts, burns, swollen joints, suspicious rashes, and all the vague ailments people get from living outdoors before antibiotics became a thing. The Cherokee brewed it for fevers, the Maca crushed it into poultices, and the Salish used it for sore throats and ulcers. If you were bleeding, self-heal stopped it. If you were infected, it slowed it down. If you were tired of life's nonsense, it gave you a warm tea that tasted like wet moss and perseverance. Chemists later discovered rosmarinic acid, betulinic acid, and flavonoids, words that make pharmacists salivate. Studies in the 21st century confirmed antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties, as though modern science were politely catching up with a grandmother's common sense. One researcher even called it a potential wound healing agent, which is the academic way of saying, it works, sorry for the delay. What makes self-heal remarkable isn't just what it did, but where it did it. It thrived in neglected soil, roadside ditches, between stones near long-abandoned camps. The plant didn't wait for human gardens, it followed human mess. Its very presence suggested a philosophy. Medicine doesn't have to be rare to be miraculous. You didn't climb mountains or recite epics to find it. You bent down. Healing, it turned out, was growing next to your shoe. Other small herbs joined it in this democratic league of healers. Yarrow, Achillea, millefolium. Another favorite was sprinkled on wounds to stop bleeding, brewed for colds, and applied as a charm against nightmares. Wild mint treated stomach pains and also improved your chances of surviving communal meals involving questionable meat. Even plantain, kind sprouting through cracked sidewalks, today was revered for pulling splinters, bee stings, and infections right out of the skin, like a leafy extraction tool that refused credit. The old medicine people knew their catalogue well. A healer could walk through what looked like an empty meadow and diagnose, prescribe, and cure with a handful of weeds. To an outsider, it looked like superstition. To anyone paying attention, it was field biology conducted barefoot. They understood microclimates long before weather apps, where plants grew after certain rains, where shade changed alkaloid strength. And each harvest came with ritual. Ask permission, leave tobacco, never take the first plant you see. Ethics were part of pharmacology. Modern people like to imagine ancient medicine as mystical, but much of it was pragmatic genius hidden under ceremony. When you live close to the earth, the difference between magic and observation gets blurry. The bitter taste in a leaf tells you what it can cure. The color of sap tells you what it can heal. And the plants that thrive under trampling feet, those are the ones built for endurance. The kind we should have never stopped listening to. Because in the end, medicine wasn't about power, it was about cooperation. Every leaf, every root, every resin was part of an unspoken alliance between human persistence and plant patience. But not all healing came from green things. Some came from the ground itself, cold mineral, and oddly eloquent. If herbs were the doctors of the natural world, then clay was the pharmacist, quiet, unglamorous, but always on call. Long before detox teas and overpriced volcanic mud masks, indigenous peoples across the continent were already masters of earth-based healing. They didn't need influencers to tell them that dirt was good for you. They'd known for millennia that the ground itself held memory, minerals, and occasionally, mercy. In the Pacific Northwest, healers collected blue-gray clays from riverbanks and hot springs to treat stomach ailments and skin infections. In the Great Plains, certain families guarded the locations of sacred muds, said to draw out venom and fever. The practice wasn't superstition, it was chemistry disguised as ritual. Clays like bentonite and kaolin are rich in aluminum silicates that absorb toxins, bacteria, and oils. Modern pharmacology uses them in anticides, bandages, and even cat litter, which, if you think about it, is just a rude downgrade for something once used to heal chiefs. Some of the best-known examples come from the Heilsek people of British Columbia, who used a glacial clay later found to kill antibiotic-resistant bacteria in lab tests. Modern scientists were baffled. Elders weren't. They'd been using it for generations to treat burns, ulcers, and infections. The earth knows what's wrong with you, one elder told researchers, probably while wondering why it took them 3 centuries to figure that out. Eating clay, or geophagy, wasn't unusual either. Certain southeastern tribes consumed small amounts to ease morning sickness or neutralize spoiled food. It sounds eccentric until you realize pharmaceutical charcoal does the same thing, minus the poetry. Clay binds to toxins, reduces acidity, and provides trace minerals like calcium and iron. It was the original antacid, dug fresh and eaten with the kind of faith that makes modern doctors twitch. But not all earth medicines were swallowed. Many were spread across the skin like an apology to the body. Mud poultices cooled inflammation, soothed insect bites, and drew out infection the way gossip draws out confessions. You'd mix the clay with water or sometimes bare fat or crushed herbs and let it dry while prayers were whispered over the patient. It was both a treatment and a meditation. Watch the earth tighten, feel it pull, wait until the pain slackened its grip. The line between spiritual cleansing and dermatology was as thin as a layer of wet clay. In ceremony, clay also marked transformation. Hunters smeared it on their faces before long journeys, not as camouflage but as protection, a mineral shield against unseen forces. The color mattered. Red for vitality, white for purity, gray for healing. Some healers mixed sacred clay into paint for body markings, turning the patient into part of the medicine itself. Modern spa treatments call this ritual mud therapy. Ancient people called it Tuesday. There's something profoundly humbling about how literal it all was. When sick, return to the ground. The same substance that built your bones could also mend your wounds. No separation, no metaphor. You came from earth, so you healed with earth. And beneath that quiet simplicity lies an idea. Modern medicine rarely admits that. Sometimes the cure isn't innovation, but memory. But the ground wasn't the only thing that healed by contact. Air and fire played their parts too. Smoke carried prayers, and with them, healing. What came next was a ritual, as old as breath itself, one where medicine didn't just rest in your hands, but floated above them, shimmering in the air. If earth medicine grounded the body, smoke medicine rewired the atmosphere. The act of smudging burning sacred plants to cleanse a space, a body, or an entire community was less about fragrance and more about physics. Healers understood that air carried moods the way rivers carried silt, and sometimes it needed dredging. Across the continent, the tools varied: sage, cedar, tobacco, and sweetgrass in the north, juniper, pinyon, and desert lavender in the south. Sometimes a braid of all four, if the situation felt especially haunted. Bundles were bound with fiber or sinew, dried under the sun, and burned in bowls carved from stone or shells. The smoke wasn't waved, randomly it was guided, coaxed, sculpted through gesture. Feathers fanned it over the sick, into corners, across thresholds. To watch it was to see prayer made visible. Modern people call it cleansing energy. The old healers called it science with manners. Sage, for instance, releases negative ions when burned particles that neutralize bacteria and airborne pathogens. Cedar's smoke acts as an insect repellent and mild antiseptic. Even sweetgrass, with its soft vanilla scent, contains coumarin, a natural relaxant that calms the nervous system. What might look like mysticism was actually an elaborate form of air therapy and olfactory diplomacy with the spirit world. But smudging didn't happen alone. It was almost always paired with chant. In Navajo healing ceremonies, songs were precise: speech, note, rhythm, and word forming part of the cure. Forget a verse and you didn't just ruin the performance, you risked cosmic imbalance. The healer's voice wasn't a metaphor, it was the medicine's delivery system. The vibration mattered. Sound was a scalpel cutting through invisible sickness. Every culture that survived long enough to name its diseases eventually discovered that words could heal. The Dine Night chant, the Lakota Wichaka Waken ceremonies, the Anishinabe's Dawn Song Soul carried the same principle. Illness was disorder, and harmony could be sung back into being. You can hear traces of that logic today in hospitals piping music into recovery wards. Except the ancient versions didn't need a speaker system, just a throat and conviction. Even the direction of the smoke mattered. You didn't simply burn sage like an anxious college student before a midterm. You moved the smoke clockwise, counterclockwise, depending on whether you were calling in balance or sending out harm. The ritual was choreography disguised as house cleaning, and when the chant met the smoke sound folding into air, fire whispering through leaves, the room transformed. Some healers described the effect as waking the place up. The air grew denser, time slowed. The patient began to breathe differently. Sweat, tears, tremors, anything leaving the body was considered progress. You didn't have to believe in spirits to feel it. Even skeptics admitted that after a ceremony, something heavy always lifted. Anthropologists once dismissed this as psychological comfort. Then they measured cortisol levels in participants and found significant drops in stress hormones. Turns out faith and biochemistry were never enemies, just colleagues with bad communication. The smoke carried prayers upward, the chant anchored them downward. Between the two hung the patient, suspended in something that felt suspiciously like peace. And when the embers dimmed, when the final song faded into the crackle, the healer would sometimes smear a bit of ash across the wrist or forehead, a mark of completion, or maybe a reminder, you've been seen by the elements. But the fire that healed could also burn. For purification on a grander scale, smoke gave way to steam. The next kind of medicine didn't just fill the air, it consumed it, wrapping the body in heat, darkness, and prayer until the world outside disappeared. Every culture has its way of sweating out regrets. Some call it yoga, Some call it therapy, but in the old North American sense, purification wasn't a lifestyle, it was survival. The sweat lodge was where the human body went to remember what it was made of: water, breath, and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't die easily. At first glance, a sweat lodge looks unimpressive: low dome of willow branches, covered in hides, bark, or blankets, small enough to make claustrophobes reconsider their sins. Inside, though it was an entire cosmos, the ground represented the Earth Mother, the dome, the womb of creation. In the center sat a shallow pit where glowing stones grandfathers were placed, red-hot and humming. When water hit them, they hissed like ancient lungs exhaling. The steam was the breath of the world itself, condensed into your face. People entered on hands and knees, symbolically re-entering the earth. The heat rose, the air thickened, and within minutes the lodge became both sauna and confession booth. Sweat poured, chants began, and everyone inside slowly dissolved into pure biology. You didn't just perspire, you participated. The Lakota, Inepi, the Ojibwe, Medudiswan, and countless regional versions followed the same principle: clean the spirit by challenging the body. The ceremony could last hours, sometimes all night, with rounds marked by drumming and prayer. Between rounds, the door flap opened to let in new stones in faint mercy. The participants gasped at the cold air as though reborn, then crawled back inside willingly. Enlightenment through humidity. Healers didn't measure success by endurance, but by release. Crying, trembling, shaking signs, the ceremony was working. The logic was brutal but brilliant. If imbalance lives in the flesh, then cook it out. Modern physiology would later explain that sweating helps remove heavy metals, boosts circulation, and stimulates endorphins. Traditional wisdom already knew it by feel. After a lodge, people emerged limp, shining, euphoric, and oddly lighter, as if they'd traded a few kilos of existential dread for steam. The structure itself was temporary, dismantled after each use, reminding everyone that healing wasn't architecture, it was rhythm. You built it, used it, let it go. Nothing about the process was convenient. Crawling into a dark, boiling dome to sit cross-legged with strangers while chanting your mortality doesn't sound like self-care, yet somehow it worked. And it wasn't just physical. The songs sung inside weren't random. Each had a function: to call ancestors, to thank the stones, to release anger, to acknowledge grief. The heat loosened more than muscle, it untied memory. Participants often spoke afterward of seeing visions, animals, faces, flashes of childhood, people they'd wronged. The lodge made it hard to lie to others or to yourself. Colonial missionaries, predictably, called it barbaric. Centuries later, Western culture rediscovered the same idea under names like detox, spa, infrared therapy, and soul retreat. People now pay hundreds to sit in identical domes built by hotels. The irony would be funny if it weren't so predictable. But to the original practitioners, the lodge wasn't therapy. It was communion. It was the Earth's version of whispering, "You've been gone too long." The steam didn't just clean skin, it opened lungs to prayer, reminding the body that breath itself was sacred. And when the ceremony ended, people stepped back into the cold air, dizzy but alive, steam curling off their shoulders like smoke from an extinguished offering. Outside waited the chill, the stars, and the certainty that they'd leave something toxic behind. The next morning, though, the same people might reach for something different: not smoke, not steam, but Earth itself once again. Only this time, that Earth would speak in two languages at once: mineral and spirit. There are moments in traditional healing when you realize the planet isn't just scenery, it's the co-therapist. Clay, herbs, smoke, all of it worked better when sound entered the equation. The old healers knew that vibration could wake minerals. They didn't phrase it like physicists, but they behaved as if every handful of mud had ears. Picture it: a patient sitting in half-light, skin streaked with grey earth, a healer humming low as thunder. The chant begins not loud, not theatrical, just steady. Each syllable rides the rhythm of the pestle grinding clay with water. The paste thickens, the voice deepens, and the air changes temperature. You could call it placebo, or you could call it the oldest collaboration between acoustics and chemistry. Across the continent, different nations combined sound with earth in their own dialects of healing. The Lakota mixed red clay and sage ash for skin ailments, and sang the Wayaks Olowa, a breaking song, meant to fracture illness the way sound cracks stone. In the southeast, Clay masks used in purification rites were applied while chanting river songs that imitated the pulse of current. The medicine wasn't only in what you put on the body, but in how the body heard itself returning to rhythm. Science, centuries late to the party, would later learn that low-frequency vibration helps tissue repair and circulation. The healers already knew. They just used voices instead of machines. The clay drew out infection. The chant drew out despair. Both left behind silence and audible kind of health. The mixing bowls were usually carved stone, smoothed by generations of use. Clay from one source couldn't simply be swapped for another. Each deposit had a temperament. Some clays cooled fever, some closed wounds faster. Others were for spiritual cleansing only. You didn't improvise. A careless substitution might insult whatever lived in that soil. So the healer sang while mixing, partly to appease the spirits, partly to keep focus. It was medicine making as prayer, pharmacy as lullaby. Modern observers often mistake these songs for background music, but they were formulas. Each tone marked a stage of transformation. The watery rasp while stirring, the soft hum when the paste turned silky, the high note when the mixture began to shine faintly under lamplight. At that point, the healer would fall silent, testing texture between fingers. If the clay was to dry, the chant resumed hydration by melody. Patients described a peculiar feeling as the paste set, a pulsing under the skin, like being tuned. Maybe it was circulation, maybe suggestion, maybe both. The point wasn't certainty, it was participation. Healing required everyone, clay, voice, patient, fire, air, to remember the same rhythm for a few minutes. Then the illness, outnumbered, gave up. Anthropologists tried to document it and got the details wrong. Of course, they noted the chant's psychological effect, but skipped the part where mineral composition and sound frequency were literally measurable allies. The healers never corrected them. They had patients to attend to, and no interest in arguing with clipboards. Afterward, the clay was returned to the river, never thrown away. Medicine that took something from the earth had to be given back, used or not. The song that awakened it ended there too, fading into the water's hiss. An elegant recycling system where ethics doubled as aftercare. And while the clay cooled and the chants went quiet, a different kind of medicine began to stir. One rooted not in earth but in green abundance. Plants with petals shaped like suns, stalks that bled sap, roots that hummed faintly in the dark. The next medicines would sprout, bloom, and whisper their cures through leaves instead of stones. In the old healing gardens, beauty was suspicious. If a plant looked too lovely, it probably hurt to taste. And the aster family sunflowers, daisies, coneflowers, was a masterclass in this contradiction. Cheerful faces masking brutal efficiency. These were not delicate ornaments. They were biochemical factories with excellent branding. Across North America, hundreds of Asteraceae species served as the first aid kit of the land. The Lakota used coneflower root, what modern herbalists now market as Echinacea for infections, snake bites and sore throats. The Omaha made a poultice from sunflower leaves for fevers. The Cherokee brewed fleabane for headaches and wild chamomile for digestive chaos. It was a family of healers disguised as bouquets, collectively responsible for half the continent's recovery from whatever nature or human folly had inflicted. Echinacea, in particular, became the celebrity of the group, and for good reason. Modern pharmacology later confirmed its ability to stimulate white blood cells and increase immune response. The plant basically tells your body, "We're under attack," in a tone that's neither panicked nor polite. Long before capsules and wellness blogs, healers simply chewed the root until their tongues went number. Quick test to see if the plant was potent that year. It's the kind of quality control FDA inspectors could only dream of. Sunflowers were the more generous relatives, edible seeds, medicinal leaves, and symbolic optimism. The Plains tribes grew them not for decoration but for resilience. Burnt seeds soothed skin infections. Oil from the seed head softened wounds. Even the pollen was used ceremonially, dusted over newborns or offered in prayer for fertility and strength. The modern supermarket version with smiling packaging and heart-healthy slogans feels like the plant's long-running inside joke. Then there was yarrow, delicate and smug, thriving where nothing else dared to it. It was called woundwort for its efficiency in stopping bleeding, a talent Achilles himself supposedly admired. Hence its Latin name, Achillea. Indigenous nations used it for exactly that. nosebleeds, cuts, childbirth. A healer might grind the leaves with spit, press the paste to a gash, and within minutes, the bleeding would ease. Science later found the culprit alkaloids that constrict blood vessels and tannins that seal tissue. In other words, battlefield triage in floral form. All these plants shared a personality, adaptable, self-seeding, impossible to eradicate. They grew along trails, near camps, in the ruins of old villages. Some healers said they followed people out of kindness. Others said, out of curiosity. Wherever humans struggled, asters appeared, uninvited but indispensable. Of course, the colonists saw weeds. They always did. They catalogued, extracted, renamed, and sold the same herbs back centuries later under the label natural remedy, as if the plants had just been discovered between a yoga mat and a mason jar. The irony is that indigenous people never claimed ownership of these medicines. They claimed relationship. You didn't possess yarrow, you cooperated with it. The ritual of gathering was simple but exacting. Approach from the east, speak the plant's name, leave a small gift, usually tobacco or a strand of hair. The act wasn't superstition, it was etiquette. Healing, like conversation, worked better when you started politely. And while the sunflowers turned toward the light and the asters hummed quietly at the edges of fields, something else was happening in the background, an older transmission that had nothing to do with roots or resins. The medicine wasn't only stored in plants anymore, it was carried in voices, passed from one throat to the next, like a song that refused extinction. If modern medicine has journals and peer review, traditional medicine had songs. Knowledge didn't live in paper, it lived in lungs. Every healer was an archive, and every chant was a paragraph in the oldest textbook on the continent, one written in melody, breath, and repetition. There were no degrees, no framed diplomas, just the long apprenticeship of listening. A young apprentice sat beside an elder, learning when to speak, when to grind, when to shut up and let the wind teach the dosage. Observation replaced laboratory notes. Intuition replaced spreadsheets. It took years before a student was even allowed to gather a plant unsupervised. The first lessons weren't about identification, they were about humility. You don't harvest what you don't understand, and you don't pretend the earth works for you. Some lineages traced back centuries through oral precision. Among the dying, the healing chants, the HSHJ, or blessing wakered last days, sometimes nights, and every verse had to be recited perfectly. Forget one syllable, and the medicine lost its balance. The song wasn't metaphorical, it was a delivery mechanism. Words had weight, and sound carried instructions the plants apparently recognized. A root boiled without its accompanying chant was considered diffuseful, perhaps, but unresponsive. The Seminole remembered their plant lore through women like Susie Billy, who lived to 106 and kept thousands of herbal recipes alive through recitation. She once said the songs were what made the medicine wake up. Without them, the plants slept. Modern pharmacology might call this priming the nervous system. Billy called it respect. What's remarkable is how these traditions survived erasure. Colonization outlawed ceremonies, missionaries burned herbal texts, and government schools punished indigenous children for speaking their languages, the very languages that contained the formulas for survival. Yet the songs persisted, sung quietly in kitchens, hummed at dawn, disguised as lullabies. You can ban a ritual, but you can't outlaw melody. Knowledge wasn't centralized, it was decentralized genius. Each family, each healer, guarded a slightly different recipe or chant variation adapted to their local ecology. One community's fever remedy might include willow bark, another, sage and cedar ash. Two outsiders, it looked inconsistent. Two insiders, it was ecological nuanced medicine, evolving alongside the land itself. Transmission wasn't just teacher to student either. Plants taught to dream instruction, what anthropologists dismissively called visionary, was a recognized curriculum. A healer might dream of a certain flower glowing under the moon, and the next day find it sprouting near a stream, ready to cure the exact illness that had haunted the dream. Coincidence perhaps, but consistent coincidence tends to demand new vocabulary. Even laughter was a kind of pedagogy. Healers teased their students relentlessly. You think you found the plant. It found you. The humor kept pride from spoiling precision. Medicine required seriousness, but never solemnity. Illness, after all, already provided enough drama. Today, scientists record these songs with field microphones, flattening them into data. But the truth is, No recording can hold the warmth of a voice singing to both human and leaf. The rhythm synchronized with a heartbeat, the melody designed to be felt more than heard. The knowledge isn't in the words, it's in the air vibrating between them. And even as the songs passed from mouth to mouth, another kind of validation arrived, centuries late and clad in lab coats. The world that once called this superstition was suddenly publishing peer-reviewed apologies. It took Western science about 400 years to say, you know what, the grandmothers were right. After centuries of calling indigenous medicine, folklore, superstition, or everyone's favorite colonial adjective primitive, researchers finally started checking the ingredients. The results were awkward for the textbooks. Nearly every plant dismissed by early explorers as witchcraft turned out to have measurable pharmacological properties. Take willow bark. Used by countless tribes for headaches and joint pain, it contains salicin, the natural forerunner of aspirin, or golden seal, whose bright yellow root stains everything it touches, and whose antimicrobial compound, berberine, is now found in supplements marketed as immune support. Yarrow stops bleeding. Echinacea boosts white blood cells. Bearberry treats urinary infections. The list goes on until you start to realize modern pharmacies look suspiciously like rebranded longhouses. In 2001, the US Department of Agriculture published a study showing that over 25% of modern drugs originate from plants once used by indigenous peoples. In 2023, another review catalogued more than 2,500 medicinal plants used across native North America. The sheer biodiversity of the old pharmacopoeia was staggering. Each species adapted not only to a microclimate, but to a cultural context. The science was precise. It was just delivered in song instead of Latin. The funny part is how modern researchers now describe these same plants. Immunomodulatory, botanical, anti-inflammatory, bioactive, antimicrobial, alkaloid complex, which is academic for tea that works. If early explorers had simply asked the women boiling those teas, instead of writing them off, humanity could have skipped several centuries of bad chemistry and worse bedside manner. The rediscovery phase hasn't been without irony. Laboratories isolate the active compound, patent it, and sell it back to the descendants of the people who first used it. It's like stealing someone's grandmother's soup recipe, removing the vegetables, and calling it innovation. Meanwhile, indigenous herbalists still remind anyone who will listen that the plant's power doesn't live in the molecule. It lives in relationship, how it's gathered, sung to, and shared. One particularly poetic case involved the Heiltsek clay of British Columbia. For generations, it was used for ulcers and wounds. In 2018, microbiologists discovered it kills 16 different antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Nature's version of a mic drop. The elders nodded politely. They'd been saying so all along. The scientists celebrated a new discovery. The clay, presumably, rolled its eyes. There's also growing research on ceremonial plants like sage and cedar. Studies show that burning sage reduces airborne dark bacteria by up to 94%, essentially a microbial massacre with pleasant aroma. Sweetgrass compounds reduce stress markers in the brain. Tobacco, when used ritually rather than recreationally, modulates focus and mood. Every modern study reads like a belated apology wrapped in a grant proposal. Of course, what the data can't quite measure is context. The ceremony, the ethics, the care. Indigenous medicine wasn't just chemical, it was ecological. Healing one body without harming another was part of the code. Western science, still learning empathy one paper at a time, has yet to replicate that part of the formula. Yet here we are, centuries later, rediscovering the old world in petri dishes. The language has changed, but the truth hasn't. The earth knew what it was doing, and it was very patient about being ignored. And as the microscopes hum and the grants renew, another quieter concern lingers at the edge of every rediscovery, the question of what's left. How much of this knowledge still lives in its original form, and how much has been buried under the weight of forgetting? For every plant that science finally bothered to validate, a dozen more slipped quietly out of memory. Knowledge has a half-life, and colonization accelerated its decay like radiation. Whole systems of healing, entire vocabularies of plants, minerals, and ritual were erased, one burned lodge and one banned ceremony at a time. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of medicine, it was the loss of method, of how to think about medicine in the first place. When missionaries arrived, they didn't only outlaw pagan rituals, They criminalized expertise. Healers became witch doctors. Ceremonies became superstition, and a millennium of clinical observation was replaced by scripture. Some tribes hid their knowledge underground literally. Herbs were buried in clay pots or encoded in beadwork patterns, each stitch a mnemonic for dosage or season. Others disguised their medicine as religion, chants rebranded as hymns, smudging as incense for saints, survival through linguistic camouflage. The irony is that colonial medicine itself was floundering at the time. European doctors were still bleeding patients and prescribing mercury for everything from coughs to melancholy. Meanwhile, indigenous midwives were managing childbirth with herbs that actually prevented infection. But history, as usual, belongs to whoever writes the footnotes. Then came the boarding schools, where indigenous children were stripped of language, the main vessel of medical knowledge. A chant forgotten is a cure forgotten. Generations grew up fluent in English, but illiterate in the syntax of healing. When the last speaker of a language dies, it isn't just poetry that disappears the recipe for balance between body and world. In some places, the suppression was physical. Sacred groves were cut for timber, wetlands drained, plants reclassified as noxious weeds. Golden seal nearly vanished under commercial OSHA root, overpicked for supplements, is now listed as a species of concern. Even the soil changed, poisoned by agriculture and mining, so the old herbs no longer grew where they used to. Healing became a form of archaeology, yet the knowledge never vanished completely. It hid in fragments. Grandmothers who still whispered the names of plants under their breath, hunters who still carried bare root in pouches, elders who mixed tobacco and sage before every journey. These fragments began resurfacing in the late 20th century, often through community health movements that treated cultural revival itself as medicine. Reclaiming the language of herbs became an act of resistance, as vital as protest or policy. Modern ethnobotanists are now scrambling to document what's left, but recording isn't the same as restoring. A plant in a spreadsheet doesn't heal anyone. The challenge isn't preservation, it's participation. As many indigenous healers point out, medicine dies when it's turned into data. It lives only when it's practiced, sung, and shared. Still, there's hope buried under the loss. Seeds sleep for centuries, so does knowledge. Sometimes all it takes is rain, literal or cultural, for something old to sprout again. Across reservations and rural clinics, herbal apprenticeships are returning. Sweat lodges are rebuilt. Youth learn to smudge with the same reverence their ancestors did. Every chant revived is a quiet rebellion against extinction. But revival comes with another question. How do you honor the old ways in a world addicted to convenience? Because once you remember the medicine, you also remember its cost: time, attention, humility. Healing that demands those things has trouble competing with pills that work in under an hour. Still, there's a strange satisfaction in watching the old knowledge rise from the soil like a weed no empire could kill. Some medicines were forgotten. Others simply went underground, waiting for the noise of progress to fade. And now, as the noise finally quiets, what emerges isn't nostalgia, it's instruction. The lesson that healing was never meant to be efficient. It was meant to be honest. Somewhere between a pharmacy aisle and a forest trail, humanity got lost. We learned to fix symptoms but forgot how to stay well. We learned to measure chemicals but not gratitude. The indigenous medicines of North America weren't quaint relics. They were blueprints for how to live without constantly declaring war on your own body. What made them powerful wasn't just their chemistry, though the chemistry was impressive. It was the worldview that came with them, that a cure doesn't come from dominance but from diplomacy. You didn't conquer a fever, you negotiated with it. You didn't take medicine, you participated in it. Even pain was a collaborator, not an anemia messenger telling you something about your balance with the world had gone off script. Modern science, with all its brilliance, still struggles with that humility. It asks how medicine works, rarely why it matters. It dissects the plant, extracts the molecule, and publishes a paper, missing the part where healing is an active relationship. A sage leaf doesn't burn the same for someone who refuses to thank it. A chant doesn't resonate if sung like a lab report. The power wasn't in superstition, it was in attention, a commodity, now rarer than antibiotics. And yet, the world is slowly circling back. We're rediscovering clay masks for skin, willow bark for pain, echinacea for colds, and calling it innovation. But the ancestors might argue that what we've truly rediscovered is patience. Their medicine worked slowly, intentionally, demanding presence. You couldn't binge heal. You had to show up, breathe, sweat, apologize to a plant, and occasionally sit in silence long enough for the cure to notice you. Maybe that's why these traditions still haunt modern wellness culture. Deep down, we suspect the real illness isn't bacterial, it's existential. The body knows how to mend. It's the spirit that's been ghosting its own appointments. Indigenous healing was never just about avoiding death. It was about remembering how to be alive. The plants, the clay, the chants, they were tools for tuning consciousness back to its natural frequency. Slow, rhythmic, cooperative. There's a kind of dark humor in how far we've drifted. We now need research grants to confirm that smoke cleanses air, or that singing reduces stress, or that clay soothes wounds. The old healers would probably smile politely and say, "Yes, dear, that's what we said the first." Then they'd offer you tea that smells like dirt and truth. The lesson isn't to romanticize the past, it's to recognize continuity. The same earth that fed the ancestors feeds us. The same rivers still carry the minerals that once healed feverish skin. The same wind that spread sage smoke still moves through our lungs. The difference is that they listened. We scroll. If the story of these forgotten medicines teaches anything, it's that health was never meant to be sterile. It was meant to be participatory, messy, and beautifully slow. The cure wasn't hidden, it was ignored, because it asked too much honesty. And maybe that's where the real medicine still lies. Not in another discovery, but in remembering what it feels like to kneel down, touch the soil, and thank something older than language for still waiting on us to notice. The first time a human bled, the world probably went very quiet. There was no language yet for wound, no word for infection, just the sight of red leaking from skin, and the sudden, horrifying realization that the body wasn't as sealed as everyone had assumed. Prehistoric life offered plenty of sharp lessons: claws, stones, teeth, and stupidity. Every hunter eventually became a patient, and so, long before the first surgeon or priest, there was panic. That was medicine's real origin story. Archaeologists love to describe these moments with gravitas. The birth of early medical practice, as though someone put down their spear and declared, "I shall now specialize in wound management." In truth, the first healers were improvisers with a keen interest in not dying. When a cut opened, instinct said, "Press it, pack it, cover it." Soil, ash, moss, animal fat, anything that looked like it could keep the red inside. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it guaranteed tetanus. Progress has always been a matter of ratios. Even without microscopes, people quickly noticed patterns. Wounds washed in running water healed better than those left with dirt. Fire stopped bleeding, but also arms. Smoke stung, but infection seemed to retreat from it. So they experimented. A handful of ash pressed to a wound, a poultice of clay, a wrap of leaves tied with sinew. When the pain lessened, they called it luck. When it didn't, they called it spirits. Science and superstition were never enemies, they were roommates sharing rent. There's physical evidence of this cautious genius. Skeletons from 20,000 years ago show clean bone healing after fractures, meaning someone set them right. Trypan skulls holes drilled to release pressure display neat bone regrowth. Whoever performed those surgeries did it with stone blades and astonishing success rates. Considering anesthesia at the time meant bite this stick and try not to ascend. They learned anatomy one mistake at a time, which is probably how everyone still learns it, just with fewer screams. Blood itself terrified and fascinated early people. It was clearly life-warm, bright, irreplaceable, and its loss felt like watching the soul escape. Every culture turned it into symbol. The Egyptians called it the fluid of divinity. The Greeks thought it housed the spirit. Many indigenous peoples saw it as a living memory. In anthropology, this is often summarized as the sacralization of bodily fluids, which is an elegant way of saying that spilling blood turned into theology faster than you could say infection. The link between fear and healing was unbreakable. The same hands that trembled at the sight of injury began developing rituals to steady themselves: songs, chants, rhythmic breathing. Those rituals accidentally reduced shock, calmed the wounded, and kept groups organized. Modern psychology would later give it fancy terms like emotional regulation and community response. The ancestors just called it not losing your mind while your friend was bleeding out. There's also evidence that ochre, the red mineral found in Paleolithic burials, was applied to wounds as early antiseptic. Iron oxide, mixed with fat or ash, kills bacteria. It also happens to look eerily like blood, which must have made the treatment feel less like repair and more like replacement. You lose some red, you add some back. Symbolically and chemically, it worked. Medicine, it seems, started as art therapy. And over time, those who could make bleeding stop, who could coax pain into silence, became something new. Not warriors, not hunters, but intermediaries between life and its interruptions. Their power was part observation, part theater, and entirely necessary. Because every time a wound closed, instead of killing someone, the tribe's faith in this new profession, healer, shaman, witch doctor grew, and nothing builds authority faster than surviving your own experiments. Still, instinct could only take them so far. Observation needed repetition. Someone had to keep track of which plants soothed and which ones caused hallucinations, followed by death. And from that slow, smoky process, a profession began to crystallize, one built, not on miracles, but on memory. Every profession begins with an accident. For healing, it was probably the moment someone smeared the wrong plant on the right wound, and watched it close instead of rot. Word spread fast in the kind of society where gossip doubled as emergency protocol. Suddenly, one person wasn't just lucky, they were talented. And just like that, the first healer was born, without ceremony, salary, or the faintest idea of job security. The title came with power, and power always demands performance. A healer wasn't just expected to cure, they had to convince. They learned to speak with composure, to move deliberately, to appear in control even when staring into an infected gash that looked like the mouth of hell. Healing became half science, half theater. Anthropologists call this the ritualization of treatment. The rest of us might call it confidence with props. Soon, every community had someone who knew which roots stopped bleeding, which leaves dulled pain, and which mushrooms should be admired from a safe distance. Their laboratories were forests and riverbanks, their textbooks the memories of those who lived long enough to share them. Knowledge passed through stories, chants, and repetition, refined by centuries of trial and occasional error. A good healer was a walking archive, the human version of a controlled experiment. But knowledge had its costs. Healing others meant touching the edge of the unknown. To mend a body, you had to confront its fragility daily. That kind of intimacy with mortality can't help but make a person strange. In many cultures, healers became liminal figures, neither entirely of the living nor of the dying. The Azande called them witch doctors. The Greeks, iotromantis medicine, seers. The label changed, but the role didn't. They stood between two worlds, administering logic to fear and prayer to logic. Gender played a part too. Women, often the gatherers and caretakers, became specialists in herbs and childbirth. Men, more prone to injury through hunting and war, handled trauma and bone setting. Together they built a medical system grounded, not in hierarchy, but in practicality. Whoever could fix it, did. Later, of course, civilizations would ruin this efficiency by introducing titles, hierarchies, and billing codes. It's easy to forget how empirical these people were. Before microscopes, they already recognized infection by smell, by heat, by the color of pus, which, in fairness, is how most of us still diagnose disaster. They tracked seasonal changes in disease, noticed which wounds healed faster when covered in honey or clay, and which ones worsened near stagnant water. That's not mysticism. It's epidemiology in animal skins. Of course, not every treatment worked. Some potions were more wishful than medical. There were rituals involving singing to stop bleeding, blowing on burns to chase away evil heat, or tying knots in cords to symbolically bind pain. It's easy to laugh until you realize that many of these rituals achieved what modern clinicians would call placebo-induced physiological response, meaning people got better because they believed they would. Faith, as it turns out, makes an excellent antibiotic. As their reputations grew, so did their responsibilities. Healers became keepers of social order, mediators between the sick and the supernatural, the living and the recently deceased. A cut that refused to heal might signal a curse. A fever could mean ancestral displeasure. Their work expanded from wound care to diplomacy with unseen forces. Medicine and religion fused like bone and scar tissue, impossible to separate without causing bleeding. By then, Healing was no longer improvisation. It was institution. And institutions love tools. The next stage of evolution didn't depend on chance or courage, but on what they could scoop from the earth itself. The healers began reaching down into the soil, pulling up the first real pharmacopoeia powders, clays, ashes that could stop decay where prayer couldn't. It's hard to imagine, but the first antiseptic wasn't invented, it was stepped on. Long before soap or sterile gauze, healers looked down at the ground and decided it was worth a try. After all, the earth absorbed blood, swallowed decay, and somehow stayed alive. So, they reasoned, maybe it knew something they didn't. Across continents, from Africa's red soils to the clays of the Americas, the ground became a medical collaborator. When a wound festered, the healer reached for ash, soft, alkaline, and conveniently available after any decent fire. Burned plant matter contained salts and carbon that killed bacteria long before anyone could name them. In modern terms, it changed pH and dehydrated microbes. In prehistoric terms, it just worked. Ash also had a flair for symbolism. Death from fire used to preserve life. You don't get more poetic chemistry than that. Then came clay, cool, heavy, and oddly intelligent. It stuck where it needed to, drew out heat, and dried pus into a crust that could be peeled away with dignity. The ancient Egyptians packed wounds with Nile mud mixed with honey. Native American healers used bentonite and kaolin for boils and snake bites. The Himba in Namibia still use red ochre, rich in iron oxide, both as decoration and disinfectant. Science would later confirm what instinct already knew. These minerals bind toxins, absorb bacteria, and speed up healing. The ground was sterile before humans were. What fascinates anthropologists is how early people read the landscape like a medical manual. Clays from volcanic regions were prized for fevers. Pale river clays cooled burns. The colors mattered: red for vitality, white for purification, black for drawing out illness. You can still find these chromatic rituals in modern healing traditions, diluted into spa treatments and overpriced detox masks. Somewhere, a Neolithic healer is watching a wellness influencer and laughing into eternity. Smoke, too, was a physician with good bedside manners. Fire purified what the hand couldn't reach. When wounds smelled of rot, smoke from juniper, sage, or cedar was wafted over them, not just to please the spirits, but to fumigate reality. Burning these resins released formaldehyde-like compounds and phenols, real antimicrobial agents hiding behind divine fragrance. Ritual and chemistry danced together, and neither seemed offended by the other's presence. What looks like superstition from a distance often turns out to be good observation filtered through myth. When a healer told you to bury a bloodied bandage so the earth could eat the sickness, they were preventing flies, and thus infection. When they advised keeping wounds near firelight so spirits couldn't find them, they were inventing early sterilization. They didn't need germ theory, they had pattern recognition. Even the act of applying clay was a ritual in patience. It cooled the pain, slowed the heartbeat, and gave both healer and wounded something to do besides panic. Modern hospitals call that stabilization. Prehistoric camps just called it staying calm, while dirt did its job. And yet, no matter how effective these earthy remedies were, there were moments they failed, when the infection dug deeper, or the bleeding wouldn't stop. That's when the healers turned to a different element entirely. Earth could draw out disease, but only fire could close the gate. If earth was the patient healer, fire was the brutal one, the doctor who didn't ask permission. It's hard to overstate how terrifying early cauterization must have been. Imagine being told the cure for bleeding to death was more fire. And yet, for thousands of years, people trusted the flame. They had to. Infection kills slowly, fire kills quickly, but sometimes not at all. Archaeological evidence shows that by the Bronze Age, cautery was standard procedure. Blades were heated in the fire until they glowed, then pressed to wounds to stop bleeding. The smell of burning flesh, the hiss of steam, it wasn't just medicine. It was theater of survival. Ancient Egyptians used heated bronze instruments for amputations, while Greek physicians like Hippocrates recommended red-hot irons to dry humors, which is one way of saying close the wound and hope the patient doesn't scream themselves into shock. But outside the civilized chaos of ancient cities, fire medicine had its own rhythm. Among indigenous cultures, heat wasn't just destructive, it was cleansing. Wounds were smoked with herbs instead of seared with metal. Smoke from juniper or cedar was thought to carry away sickness, and in a sense, it did. Modern studies confirm those smokes release compounds that kill airborne bacteria. Healers didn't burn for punishment, they burned for purification. Even across oceans, the symbolism aligned. In Japan, moxibustion burned mugwort near the skin to stimulate healing. In Africa, hot stones were pressed to the body to drive out cold sickness. Among the plains tribes of North America, smoke was blown over wounds as a barrier between the flesh and whatever invisible thing might crawl inside. Everyone, everywhere, agreed on one thing. The fire wasn't evil, it was order, and the logic was sound. Heat stopped bleeding by sealing vessels. It sterilized blades before cutting. It dried damp wounds, warded off flies, and frightened infection out of its hiding place. Pain was the price of progress. Healers learned to balance agony against survival, to hold the torch just long enough. Their skill wasn't in avoiding pain, it was in measuring it. What fascinates anthropologists is how the ritual never divorced from the science. Before the burn, a prayer. After it, smoke. The fire became sacred not because it was divine, but because it was terrifying, and anything that powerful demanded ceremony. A healer heating their blade might chant to steady their hand. The chant itself lowered their heart rate and made the cut cleaner. Psychology masquerading as religion again. Some healers even used smoke diagnostically. If burned herbs curled a certain way, it meant the spirit of the wound was appeased. If not, infection lingered. A poetic system, yes, but also a practical one. Different smokes revealed different smells, and smell was often the first sign of rot. You didn't need microscopes when your nose worked just fine. And of course, there was the irony. The same flame that destroyed could also preserve. Wounds sealed by fire didn't fester. Bodies embalmed in smoke didn't decay. Two early societies that looked like immortality in slow motion. Fire, they thought, must be the border between life and whatever came next. Yet even fire had limits. It stopped bleeding, but it didn't rebuild flesh. Scars formed, some proud, some painful. The next frontier wasn't about sealing wounds, but coaxing skin to remember itself, to knit, to grow, to forgive. And for that, they turned to what the earth made quietly in its sleep, the plants. Once humans realized dirt and fire could only do so much, they turned to the quiet green things growing between them. Plants were less dramatic than flames, but far more patient, and they had chemistry on their side. Long before penicillin, healers were plucking small miracles out of the ground and boiling them into salvation. Every culture had its own pharmacopoeia. The Egyptians swore by garlic and honey, smearing the mixture over wounds like antiseptic caramel. The Sumerians used willow bark for pain, a natural source of salicin, the ancestor of aspirin. In the Americas, yarrow leaves were chewed into pulp and pressed into cuts to stop bleeding. In Asia, turmeric turned everything it touched golden, including the edges of infected skin. If the earth had a first aid kit, it was leafy, bitter, and occasionally hallucinogenic. The discovery process wasn't pretty. It involved a lot of observation, courage, and trial and error bordering on Darwinism. You'd watch which plants the animals chewed after injury. You'd try it yourself, then hope for enlightenment rather than organ failure. Somewhere in that chaos, humans started to build a taxonomy of healing. Plants that cooled, plants that heated, plants that purified, and plants that killed you for asking the wrong question. The success stories are remarkable. Honey, used since prehistory, is still one of the most effective topical antibiotics known. It draws out moisture, suffocates bacteria, and promotes tissue regeneration. Modern hospitals now use sterile honey bandages for wounds too stubborn for drugs. Yarrow, that unassuming roadside weed, contains alkaloids that constrict blood vessels and speed clotting. Garlic sulfur compounds destroy microbes faster than you can ruin a date with your breath. None of it was accidental. It was data collection disguised as superstition. And they didn't just apply the herbs, they choreographed them. A healer wouldn't simply slap leaves on a wound. There was rhythm to it. Grind, mix, hum, apply. Every action slowed the process down enough for both patient and practitioner to calm. That calm, as modern research confirms, does half the healing. The ritual wasn't decorative. It was a psychological anesthetic. It's also worth remembering that these plants didn't appear in isolation. Each existed within a small ecology of meaning. In some cultures, yarrow was sacred to the moon. In others, garlic was a weapon against the unseen. The idea that a plant's spirit helped fight disease wasn't naivety, was an early understanding of synergy. The belief that environment and healing are inseparable. You can sterilize a wound, but if the air, the food, or the mind remain toxic, the infection simply changes address. Even after agriculture and empire, these plant-based systems endured. Medieval monks copied herbal manuscripts that had already been ancient for centuries. Indigenous nations kept their green libraries alive through oral teaching. Every leaf carried a lineage. By the time modern pharmacology showed up, humanity had already tested millions of compounds by hand, guided by intuition and desperation, and found most of the ones we still use. Of course, plants were not the only helpers. Healers were scavengers of opportunity. When a plant failed, they turned to the animals, who, unlike humans, never doubted their own instincts. Fat, silk, bone, and honeycombs soon entered the medical canon, proving that healing wasn't a strictly botanical affair. It was ecological, collaborative, and occasionally unsettling. When the forests and meadows had offered all they could, humans looked to their neighbors, the furred, the scaled, the crawling, to borrow a little anatomy. The animal world was a pharmacy with teeth, and early healers learned quickly that survival sometimes meant recycling someone else's biology. Bear fat, for instance, was the original ointment, thick, sterile, and rich in vitamin D. It stayed solid even in the heat of summer and sealed wounds like organic wax. Arctic peoples mixed it with powdered herbs or ash, creating salves that repelled flies, softened scars, and even soothed frostbite. It wasn't pretty, but neither was dying of infection. Where we now see rendered animal fat, they saw a second Skinner, literal donation from one body to patch another. And then there was honey, the medicine that still hasn't retired. Healers noticed long ago that honeyed wounds didn't rot. Today, we know why. Honey's high sugar concentration pulls moisture out of bacteria, dehydrating them to death. It's sweet revenge at the microbial level. The Egyptians packed surgical wounds with honey and resin. The Maya did the same with stingless bee, honey mixed with crushed bark. Even the Greeks, normally pessimistic about everything, agreed it was divine. Spider silk sounds like witchcraft, but it's one of the oldest wound dressings known. Stronger than steel by weight, flexible, and antiseptic. It was gathered from webs and layered over small cuts to form natural gauze. Roman soldiers used it on the march. So did indigenous peoples in the Americas. It even contained vitamin K, helping blood clot. The only downside was that the patient occasionally ended up with an accidental pet spider, which was probably considered an omen rather than an error. Bones, too, had their place powdered into paste for setting fractures or ground into poultices for deep wounds. The logic wasn't far off. Bones contained calcium and phosphorus, both critical for repair. Burnt bones, reduced to fine ash, made alkaline powders that disinfected like early antibiotic dust. You could say ancient medicine practiced bioengineering, just without the grant funding. There was also a kind of spiritual reciprocity in using animals for healing. Every culture that did so acknowledged it wasn't free. The healer made offerings, feathers, songs, smoked to thank the creature's spirit for its unwilling contribution. This wasn't sentimentality, it was protocol. Healing wasn't about extraction, it was about balance. The idea that every cure carried a cost kept the process humble, and humility, oddly enough, seems to improve outcomes. Even modern biomedicine owes a debt here. Collagen dressings, lanolin creams, gelatin capsules, surgical silk oil, descendants of those early experiments. The difference is that ancient healers did it with reverence. We do it with sterile gloves and quarterly reports. The irony is that both methods work, though only one leaves you with a sense that the universe might actually care whether you recover. The use of animal medicine also blurred lines between the physical and the symbolic. Fat could heal flesh, yes, but it could also seal in spirit. Honey sweetened prayers as well as wounds. Silk bound not just tissue, but intention. Healing became an act of weaving the living world into the body again, restitching a temporary separation. But even with all this ingenuity, something was missing. A wound might close, but pain lingered, fear lingered. And the healers, always observant, noticed that sometimes the same wound healed faster under one pair of hands than another, which led to a new discovery not about what they used, but how they touched. Before there were herbs, before there was fire, before the word healer meant anything, there was touch, a reflex more ancient than language, one creature reaching for another in pain. You see it everywhere, a mother pressing her hand to a child's bruise, a hunter clutching a wound before he even looks at it. Touch came first, and for a long time, it was enough. Early healers understood that hands could do more than apply poultices. They could anchor the body to the world again. When someone was bleeding or shaking, the hand of another was the first medicine. Warmth slowed panic. Pressure stopped bleeding. Stillness told the body that chaos was temporary. The rest, herbs, chants, clay, came later as accessories to the real therapy. Presence. Anthropologists have found the ritual of touch everywhere. In Paleolithic burials, skeletons are arranged with arms folded over chests, as if someone once held them there. In later healing rites, the gesture became deliberate. The Greeks called it epaph, the laying of hands. The Hebrews called it seka. In countless indigenous languages, the word for to heal translates literally to touch with care. Every civilization eventually invented the same motion, and none of them thought it needed explanation. But touch, like medicine itself, was never neutral. It carried hierarchy and taboo. Some cultures reserved it for healers only, people who had been ritually purified, whose contact would not offend the spirits of illness. Others considered touch a communal act. Among the Navajo, for instance, when a child was injured, everyone in the family touched the wound in turn, not because they thought it helped, but because it acknowledged shared responsibility. In Japan, similar tenderness evolved into uma massage. In Polynesia, into lomolome. The methods differ. The message doesn't. There was also the practical magic of heat. Hands warmed by fire or friction could ease muscle spasms, soften clotted blood, calm fever. Rubbing the skin before applying salve improved circulation, a detail rediscovered by medicine thousands of years later and rebranded as therapeutic massage. Even the word care itself carries the ancient idea of tending through the palms, not the mouth. Modern science now explains what ancient hands already knew. Gentle touch releases oxytocin, lowers cortisol, slows the heart rate. But healers never needed to measure hormones to trust what they saw. Wounds stopped throbbing, breath steadied, fear dissolved. The placebo effect, the skeptics might say. Compassion, the healers would reply. Both were right. And yet, touch could also be dangerous. In a world without soap, contamination spread fast. Some healers washed their hands in smoke or salt before treatment, not out of piety, but pattern recognition. They learned that those who performed purification rituals tended to live longer. Religion, again, had disguised hygiene. Over time, the hand itself became symbolic, a bridge between worlds. In art, the healer's palm glows, extends, hovers. It's not an accident. To lay a hand on someone was to take temporary ownership of their pain. That's what healing demanded, not distance, but absorption. But as touch turned ritual, the logic expanded. If pain could enter through the skin, maybe other things could too. Spirits, curses, unseen forces. Wounds became openings, not just for infection, but for intrusion. And that changed everything. A simple cut was no longer just physical damage. It was a cosmic event. At some point, every civilization decided the same unsettling thing. Wounds weren't just injuries, they were doorways. When the skin tore, something invisible slipped in. The body wasn't sealed anymore, and that meant it wasn't just vulnerable to rot, but to whatever else wandered between the worlds. The healer's job suddenly expanded from physical repair to border control. Among ancient peoples, illness rarely arrived alone. It had a personality, a mood, sometimes a name. Infection wasn't bacteria, it was possession. You didn't just clean a wound, you negotiated with what had entered. The Greeks called it miasma, a spiritual pollution that needed ritual purification. The Navajo called it ch, a malignant presence that disturbed harmony. In West Africa, the wound was said to speak if the spirit inside was restless. The smell, the fever, the trembling pulse, all signs that diplomacy was failing. This wasn't ignorance. It was metaphor doing its best to describe microbiology. The ancients saw how wounds turned angry, how they reddened, swelled, frothed, that looked alive, so they gave it a soul. And to cure it, you had to address it politely. So they sang, smoked, whispered. Words became antiseptic. A healer might chant a story about the skin closing like dawn after night, or blow smoke across the wound to confuse the spirit. Modern medicine calls this stress reduction. Anthropology calls it narrative therapy. Incantations, oddly enough, had measurable effects. Reciting them slowed breathing, steadied the healer's hands, comforted the patient. The voice became a tool as sharp as a scalpel, one that could rearrange panic into cooperation. Among the Zulu, healers would draw circles around the wound with red clay while humming a protective melody. In the Arctic, Inuit shamans spat gently over injuries to drive out breath sickness. In both cases, the ritual introduced airflow, warmth, and mild sterilization. The science was hiding inside the superstition like a seed under frost. But not all spirits were hostile. Some were invited. A few cultures believed that when the skin opened, helpful ancestors could slip in and assist the healing. Among the Mimbori, wounds were blessed as sacred sites of transformation. In parts of the Amazon, healers whispered to the spirits of plants already applied to the flesh, asking them to hunt whatever invader remained. Infection and divinity were separated by intention. What entered you mattered less than how you treated it. Still, there was danger in too much interpretation. A badly healed wound could be read as divine punishment. A fever could mean the wrong offering had been made, the wrong song sung. Sometimes, healing became confession. What have you done to offend the unseen? The moral weight of illness has outlived its myth. Even today, people say they're paying for it when they get sick. The vocabulary just traded spirits for stress. The healer's toolkit then wasn't just roots and fire. It was storytelling. A wound had to be re-narrated from invasion to recovery, from contamination to cleansing. The ritual wasn't there to decorate medicine. It was medicine, reshaping how the body experienced itself. The immune system, after all, responds as much to belief as to bacteria. And once the spirit was appeased, the wound closed. But it didn't disappear. It left a memory, a scar that recorded the negotiation. Over time, those scars became something more than evidence of injury. They turned into identity, proof that the body could break and still return. A healed wound never really leaves. It just changes jobs. Once it stops hurting, it starts talking. Every scar is a confession, a visible reminder that the body has already died a little once and changed its mind. Early societies understood that. They treated scars not as imperfections, but as proof of successful negotiations with chaos. Among many hunter-gatherer groups, scars were badges of reliability. A person with visible ones was someone who had met disaster and returned with information. It's easy to see how that became status. In some African and Pacific cultures, the process was formalized into scarification, deliberate wounding to simulate healing, a kind of aesthetic resume. Each mark recorded endurance, initiation, or survival. The flesh turned into autobiography. The act itself was less violent than it sounds. The skin was cut or pricked in patterns, then rubbed with ash, clay, or plant resin to raise the design. The resulting reliefs weren't just decorative. Many of those materials had antibacterial properties. Charcoal to dry the wound, ash to sterilize, resin to seal. Beauty and infection control, achieved in one painful sitting. Even outside ritual scarification, ordinary wounds became social currency. A hunter returning with a stitched gash wasn't pitied. He was admired. In the Arctic, frostbite scars were a sign of endurance. In Polynesia, tattooing grew directly out of wound treatment rituals, the ink replacing the ash. In some indigenous American tribes, children were told to touch the scars of elders to learn bravery through the skin. You could argue that empathy itself began as a tactile education, but not all scars were celebrated. Some marked shame, punishment, failure. Medieval Europe turned branding into law enforcement. Ancient China tattooed criminals. The same biological process, collagen rebuilding tissue, could mean redemption or stigma, depending on who owned the knife. Healing was neutral. Culture wasn't. What fascinates anthropologists is how these meanings often overlapped. In one context, a scar meant divine favor. In another, divine anger. Sometimes, both at once. The contradiction made sense because scars themselves are contradictions, evidence of pain and proof of repair, ugliness becoming function. In many ways, they were the body's oldest philosophy lesson. The broken thing is the record of survival, not the failure of it. The care for wounds didn't end when the skin closed. Healers often revisited old injuries, massaging them with oils or animal fats to soften tissue and teach the scar to forget. Modern physical therapy uses the same idea, dressed in clinical jargon. The ancients understood that if you ignored a wound too long after it closed, it might start to ache again when the weather changed, a superstition that turned out to be atmospheric pressure affecting nerves. They didn't need barometers, they had knees. Over time, these rituals of aftercare became social as well as medical. Shared maintenance of scars turned into shared stories, fireside recollections of how someone got theirs, who helped, what it cost. Healing was never private. It was communal memory etched into the skin. Each generation could trace its history across the surfaces of its elders, a living archive of pain endured and dignity preserved. And yet, even this cycle of scar and story couldn't explain everything. Some wounds healed without a mark, others festered invisibly. The healers, ever curious, began to suspect there was something deeper than flesh at work, some force that governed recovery, balance, decay. They called it spirit, breath, life force, essence. We'd later rename it homeostasis to sound less poetic. But whatever you called it, someone had to keep it intact. And so the healer's role began to shift again, from craftsman of the body to custodian of order. A person who wasn't just patching skin, but managing equilibrium itself. The fragile balance between the human and everything trying to unmake it. By the time healing became an art, it had also become a riddle. The more healers learned, the stranger their work appeared. They could stop bleeding, set bones, summon command, yet, sometimes, the same ritual that saved one life failed on another. No pattern held perfectly. Knowledge, it seemed, only deepened the mystery. Ancient healers were not scientists in the modern sense, but they behaved like them in slow motion. Observe, test, refine, repeat. Still, their experiments were bound to humility. They knew that understanding the body didn't mean mastering it. Every successful cure was followed by gratitude, and every failure by ritual apology. Modern doctors fill out forms. Ancient ones whispered to rivers. It amounts to the same confession. We don't fully control this thing we claim to understand. Many cultures treated that uncertainty as sacred, rather than shameful. The Greek Eotromantis healed through trance, claiming knowledge came from Apollo, not anatomy. Among the Mapuche of Chile, the Machi drank bitter infusions and entered visions before choosing a remedy, as though consulting a biochemical oracle. The Yoruba Babelio in West Africa cast cowrie shells to determine the spiritual temperature of a wound before applying herbs. It all sounds fantastical until you realize every one of those methods required pattern recognition, under pressure, and the capacity to read complexity skills shared by every competent clinician today. The paradox ran deep. A healer needed certainty to inspire trust, but doubt to stay alive. Too much confidence, and you spread plague. Too little, and no one lets you near them with a knife. So the best ones learned to perform assurance while privately courting mystery. They lived in a state of suspended disbelief, neither cynic nor zealot, just a witness to the body's quiet rebellion against entropy. That tension, the line between knowledge and awe, shaped how medicine evolved. It prevented arrogance, encouraged experimentation, and kept the healer human. Those who forgot it became priests. Those who denied it became butchers. Somewhere in between, the tradition survived, humming quietly through millennia, powered by dirt, fire, leaves, fat, faith, and the steady pulse of someone still willing to try. What we now call medical science was, for most of history, a conversation between the known and the unknowable. The early healers didn't separate chemistry from prayer or physiology from mythology because the world itself wasn't divided yet. To them, infection and curse were different dialects of the same language. Imbalance and balance, they understood, wasn't achieved by conquest, was maintained through relationship. Even now, every sterile operating room carries traces of that old philosophy. The surgeon scrubs like a priest, washing before sacrifice. The nurse murmurs comfort like a chant. The patient lies still, trusting strangers with their body. It's ritual wearing latex gloves. The tools changed, the choreography didn't. In the end, the ancient healer's greatest insight might have been this: healing isn't about defeating nature but persuading it. The body, like the world, prefers negotiation to violence. And every cure or new is just another peace treaty signed in flesh. So when we speak of medicine before modern science, we're really talking about medicine before arrogance, when humility was diagnostic and wonder was part of the prescription. The old healers may not have known about bacteria or antibodies, but they knew something just as crucial, that life, when respected properly, often conspires to stay alive. Civilization has always had a bad memory. It's not that we forget, we overwrite. Every empire, every industrial boom, every scientific renaissance has come with a convenient erasure notice attached. Thank you for your service, old world. Please vanish quietly. Medicine, unfortunately, got the same treatment. When the industrial age rolled in, humanity was too busy burning coal and inventing bureaucracy to remember who used to keep it alive. The healers, midwives, herbalists, the ones who fed the sick boiled bark and whispered prayers while setting bones, were suddenly unfashionable. The new gods wore lab coats, and progress, in its usual arrogance, declared that anything not measured in cubic centimeters or Latin was superstition. The irony is almost medicinal. The superstitions were already working. The plants the healers used contained the same molecules that would later make pharmaceutical companies rich. Willow bark became aspirin. Foxglove became digitalis. Moldy bread, yes, the peasant kind, became penicillin's awkward older cousin. But since the people who discovered these things didn't write them down in Latin or patent them, they were dismissed as lucky guesses by illiterates. Science, apparently, only counts if you're wearing shoes. Anthropologists have a polite way of describing this cultural lobotomy, epistemic rupture. It means we decided to pretend the last 10,000 years didn't happen. The 19th century perfected the technique. European scientists sailed around the world, collecting samples of indigenous remedies while calling the people who used them primitive. By the time they got back home, those same leaves and roots had acquired Latin names, dosage instructions, and a price tag. Nothing was stolen. Officially, it was just discovered. The new world wanted its medicine shiny, sterile, and disconnected from dirt. Laboratories replaced forests. Microscopes replaced observation, and medicine became something to be bought rather than lived with. Healing had been relational, ecological, a conversation between humans and their surroundings. Modernity turned it into a transaction. The Earth's pharmacy was paved over and renamed research facility. Yet, the old ways never disappeared. They just learned invisibility. The herbs went undercover in spice racks. The rituals survived in habits. Boiling ginger for a cold. That's ancient Chinese medicine wearing a bathrobe. Saltwater gargle. Babylonian antiseptic. Aloe on a burn. The same plant Cleopatra used, now with better packaging. Every household became a tiny museum of forgotten pharmacology, curated by grandmothers and immune systems. The real tragedy wasn't ignorance, it was pride. Once chemistry could map the shape of a molecule, humanity mistook that for understanding the world, as if knowing the chemical formula for honey somehow made bees obsolete. Progress, in its excitement, couldn't tolerate mystery. What couldn't be dissected was dismissed. The invisible connections, the ritual, the respect, the gratitude that once accompanied every cure were amputated like vestigial organs. Medicine lost its manners. By the mid-20th century, the amnesia was complete. The Global South was rebranded as untapped biodiversity, a polite way of saying still has things we can patent. Western medicine built itself on the bones of the traditional without ever admitting paternity. And perhaps the most anthropological irony of all is that while doctors were busy sterilizing scalpels, the same ancient cures were quietly returning through the back door labeled wellness industry. Now, we drink turmeric lattes and meditate on apps, congratulating ourselves for our open-mindedness, never realizing we've just repurchased the fragments of what progress told us to throw away. It's as though history hid the medicine in plain sight, waiting for us to grow humble enough to notice again. But humility is expensive, and the business of rediscovery is booming. The next step wasn't to find new cures, it was to remember who knew them first. And that led the story straight into the forests and villages, where primitive knowledge was quietly fueling every so-called modern breakthrough. Every great scientific discovery has a ghost standing behind it. Sometimes the ghost is a nameless healer from a village no map bothered to record. Sometimes it's a woman who learned by watching which roots the animals dug for when fever came. And sometimes it's an entire culture whose knowledge was stripped for parts and reassembled under a new name. Usually one ending in colonial history, for all its talk of enlightenment, functioned like a global research expedition with no footnotes. the British in India, the French in West Africa, the Spanish in the Americas, all collecting, cataloguing, and discovering medicines already in use for centuries. The Inca used cinchona bark to treat fever long before anyone in a European wig thought to call it quinine. The Yurok and Hoopa of California boiled willow bark to relieve pain a millennium before aspirin had a brand name. But when chemists in London and Berlin extracted the molecules, the narrative was rewritten. Civilization had finally invented relief. The pattern became a kind of academic ritual. Step 1. Encounter indigenous healers using plants effectively. Step 2. Write them off as mystics. Step 3. Take samples home, translate them into Latin, and publish findings as groundbreaking. The healers weren't even footnotes, they were data sources, like soil or seawater. Anthropologists later coined the term bioprospecting, which sounds far gentler than what it was. Intellectual colonization in botanical form. One of the most striking examples sits quietly in every first aid kit: curare. The Amazonian arrow poison used for hunting became the foundation of modern anesthesia. European doctors watched indigenous hunters paralyze monkeys with it, then isolated the alkaloid and turned it into a surgical tool. Nobody remembered the hunters' names. The substance got a Greek suffix, a patent, and an export license. The forest had been translated into pharmacology. Even quinine, the so-called savior of European empires, carried the same irony. Colonial officers could survive malaria in the tropics only because Andean healers shared the bark that had saved their own people for centuries. In return, the healers got missionary lectures about abandoning their superstitions. Civilization owes its tropical conquests to indigenous botany, and yet still manages to call those same people unscientific. That's not irony, it's choreography. Modern medicine still lives off this inheritance. Over 80% of pharmaceutical compounds have roots, sometimes literal ones, in traditional remedies. Neem, turmeric, aloe, ginseng, peyote, coca, willow oil, absorbed, purified, and enough. The plants lost their stories when they entered the lab. In the transition from sacred to sterile, meaning was the first contaminant to be removed. And yet, for all its arrogance, science kept returning to the same forests and mountains it once dismissed. Pharmaceutical expeditions in the 20th century read like confession steams of researchers parachuting into rainforests to rediscover the very knowledge their predecessors had tried to erase. There's a poetic symmetry to it. The modern world, kneeling in the dirt again, test tubes trembling, asking permission it forgot to seek the first time. Some anthropologists call this epistemic reconciliation, though the plants probably call it Tuesday. Nature doesn't seem bothered by plagiarism. She just keeps curing whoever's willing to listen. Still, one can't help but notice that every rediscovery brings a little less humility and a lot more marketing. What used to be ritual medicine now appears as shelf products promising ancient power in a capsule. Civilization, in its infinite creativity, found a way to gentrify wisdom. And while the scientists patented the chemistry, another transformation was already happening. The groves where those medicines once grew were being cut, fenced, and sold. The sacred plants were moving from ceremony to commerce, still powerful, still potent, but no longer free. Once upon a time, medicine grew quietly. It didn't wear a barcode or come with side effects printed in 8 languages. It simply waited in forests, deserts, swamps, for someone to ask nicely. Healing was a form of diplomacy then, a mutual agreement between humans and the landscape. You take, you thank, you return. That treaty, like all good treaties, was eventually broken. The moment humans realized plants could be sold, the forest stopped being a temple and became a warehouse. The same leaves once gathered with chance were now harvested by contract. The bark that once cured fever became colonial currency. Whole economies sprouted from what used to be sacred exchanges. Cinchona, ginseng, clove, pepper. Medicines became commodities, and commodities never stayed gentle for long. By the 17th century, the spice trade was already halfway to being the global pharmaceutical industry. Ships carried more than flavor. They carried control. Colonies weren't built around spices because Europeans had dull palates. They were built because cinnamon soothed digestion, clove eased toothache, and pepper preserved meat in hot climates. Health was empire's quiet accomplice. What began as a quest for well-being turned into logistics. Anthropologists sometimes describe this shift as the disenchantment of the grove. It's a poetic way of saying that capitalism exorcised the spirits from the plants and replaced them with invoices. The groves that once housed healing rituals became export plantations. Sacred ecology was rewritten as supply chain. Where there had been reciprocity, give a prayer, take a leaf, now there was only extraction. The patient became a consumer, and the healer became redundant. Even the geography of medicine changed. Traditional apothecaries, open air, improvisational, and local, gave way to laboratories sealed off from weather and memory. Healing became something that happened under fluorescent light. Yet, if you trace the ingredients on the back of any modern skincare bottle, you'll find the ghosts of those old groves still whispering in Latin. Aloe barbadensis, Curcuma longa, Camellia sinensis. The plants never left. They just learned to pass for chemistry. In the process, meaning was bleached out like linen. Ginseng, once revered in East Asia as a life force root, now appears on supermarket shelves in energy drinks. Aloe, once applied with ritual care to burns, is squeezed into dollar store lotions. Turmeric, a cornerstone of Ayurvedic medicine, got itself rebranded as golden milk for Instagram. It's the same medicine, just declawed, deodorized, and marked up. There's a strange circularity to it all. Industrial society, having uprooted the sacred, now sells organic as luxury. People pay for ethically sourced teas that their great-grandparents brewed for free. Entire industries thrive on rediscovering what the ancestors already knew and charging rent for access. It's not progress, it's exquisite recycling. Still, underneath all the gloss and branding, something of the old reverence lingers. The smell of clove oil, the bitter sting of willow bark, the golden smear of turmeric, they carry a memory modern packaging can't erase. Even the most commercialized products are haunted by their origins. Somewhere in every glass bottle of essential oil is a field that once had its own songs. But if meaning could be commodified, ritual could be too. As the plants moved from grove to market, the ceremonies that once accompanied them didn't vanish. They reappeared wearing yoga pants, burning incense, and charging by the hour. What was once called healing became something softer, trendier, and more profitable. Self-care. Somewhere between the burning of sage and the unboxing of skincare serums, healing lost its sense of occasion. What used to be a ceremony became a morning routine, and the sacred chant was replaced by a playlist called Healing Vibes. The altar turned into a bathroom shelf. Nothing disappears in civilization, it just gets renamed until it sounds like a marketing campaign. It's almost touching how the modern world, after centuries of mocking ritual, ended up building an entire economy around imitating it. The wellness industry is essentially anthropology with better lighting. The same gestures once offered to the gods, anointing with oils, breathing in rhythm, sitting in silence, now appear as mindfulness exercises, sold by the hour. The irony is thick enough to exfoliate with. Take incense, for instance. Once burned to carry prayers skyward, now it's aromatherapy for stress reduction. The ritual of smoke was always about purification, about making space for the unseen to enter. Modern life kept the smoke but dropped the meaning. You can now buy sandalwood sticks wrapped in plastic and imported by the crate, proof that even transcendence can be mass-produced if the font on the box looks minimal enough. Or look at yoga, once a spiritual discipline designed to dissolve the self, now a billion-dollar industry designed to sculpt it. The same postures that monks once used to quiet the ego are performed today in neon leggings under LED lights, while someone whispers, "Find your center," over ambient remixes. The ceremony survives, but the cosmos has been swapped for core strength. Anthropologists call this process cultural extraction, but it feels more like spiritual taxidermy. The body of the ritual is preserved fragrant, polished, photogenic, but its soul has been neatly removed. Healing, which used to be relational, became recreational. Where people once gathered to call balance back into the world, we now gather to balance our chakras between work emails. Still, it would be unfair to dismiss it entirely. Beneath the branding and the hashtags, something stubbornly ancient persists. People light candles not because a company told them to, but because somewhere deep in the nervous system, fire still means safety. Steam still means renewal. The body remembers even when the culture forgets. The rituals have lost their mythology, but not their muscle memory. That's the quiet paradox of modern healing. It's both parody and proof. The fact that these gestures keep resurfacing under new names, in new packaging, suggests they work on a level deeper than belief. They satisfy an old hunger the clinic never could, the need for rhythm, repetition, and awe, disguised as hygiene. And every time someone fills a bathtub with salt, lies back, and calls it detox, they're reenacting something older than medicine, older than civilization itself. The same impulse that once guided healers to rivers and caves is now guiding us to scented candles and playlists. It's a tragicomedy of anthropology, progress chasing its own tail through bubbles and incense. But beneath the irony, there's a whisper of reconciliation. Because, as empty as some of it seems, the return of ritual means the world is remembering its body again. And once the gestures are in motion, meaning tends to follow. Slowly, like light returning through smoke. And when the rituals came back, so did their ingredients. The laboratories that once dismissed the old ways began quietly testing them again, this time with microscopes. Instead of mantras, rediscovering what the healers already knew. Science loves a good apology, it just never admits it's apologizing. Every few years, a study appears in a prestigious journal declaring that, shockingly, ancient healers might have known what they were doing all along. Honey kills bacteria, sage purifies air, clay draws out infection, garlic fights viruses, and somewhere, in the collective graveyard of forgotten wisdom, 1,000,000 grandmothers roll their eyes. For centuries, the medical establishment treated traditional remedies like embarrassing relatives, tolerated at holidays, denied in public. But once the microscope got involved, curiosity began to outgrow arrogance. It turned out that nearly every folk belief had a biochemical reason behind it. Honey contains hydrogen peroxide. Willow bark carries salicin. Smudging sage reduces airborne microbes by over 90%. Suddenly, superstitions started looking suspiciously like science with better storytelling. The rediscovery phase always follows the same rhythm: ridicule, research, revelation, rebranding. Step 1, call it nonsense. Step 2, fund a study. Step 3, publish findings confirming it works. Step 4, sell it back to the public as innovation. The process turns tradition into data, data into patent, and patent into profit. If the ancient world had lawyers, most pharmaceutical companies would be bankrupt. Even the idea of antiseptics wasn't born in a lab. Long before Pasteur, healers used ash, salt, honey, and smoke to keep wounds clean. Not because they knew about microbes, they just knew what didn't rot. That's science, really. Noticing which parts of reality stay alive. The difference is that ancient healers didn't isolate molecules. They paid attention to moods, the mood of a wound, of weather, of the patient's breath. Today we call that intuition, as if observation without a clipboard was somehow less legitimate. Modern research now spends billions proving what was once common sense. Activated charcoal for poison, Egyptian papyri, tea tree oil for skin infections, Aboriginal medicine, cranberries for urinary tract health, North American tribal knowledge, turmeric for inflammation, Indian Ayurveda. The irony is that the science that once banished the old healers now depends on them for its next big breakthrough. The lab, it seems, is a latecomer to a very ancient conversation. But this rediscovery isn't just intellectual, it's existential. Every validation is a reminder that our ancestors weren't ignorant. They were empirical in their own languages. They didn't lack science, they lacked the need to separate it from spirituality. Healing was a dialogue with nature, not a conquest over it. What modern research calls bioactive compounds, they called plant spirits. Both descriptions point to the same mystery, that the living world participates in its own repair. And perhaps that's the quiet reason why people trust these rediscovered remedies so easily. They don't feel manufactured, they feel remembered. A teaspoon of honey on a sore throat still feels like something the world wanted you to know, not something it needed to sell. Still, for every rediscovered cure, there's a corresponding loss. The knowledge often returns without its context. The herb is extracted, isolated, and stripped of its ritual, leaving behind only efficiency. We get the cure but not the conversation. Healing becomes chemistry again, not relationship, yet the relationship refuses to die. It waits quietly in the oral traditions, in the recipes, in the gardens kept by those who never forgot. The lab can confirm the chemistry, but only the culture can confirm the meaning. And while scientists continue their rediscovery projects somewhere else, far from white coats and sterile glass, the keepers of that knowledge never stopped practicing it. They just did it softly out of the spotlight, out of the textbooks, waiting for the day the world would realize it still needed them. Knowledge doesn't always survive in books. Sometimes it hides in kitchens, in calloused hands, in the murmurs of women who never got to publish a single paper. For every well-documented medical breakthrough, there are 1,000 unrecorded remedies that worked too quietly to be noticed. They lived on through habit, through stubborn repetition, through the kind of trust that never asked for proof because it had memory instead. When anthropologists began studying rural medicine in the 20th century, they found what the textbooks had lost: an entire parallel archive maintained by grandmothers, herbalists, and midwives. The knowledge wasn't dead. It was just disguised as domesticity. The old healers had learned how to survive colonization, church persecution, and modernization by pretending their work was simply women's chores. A handful of herbs by the stove, a jar of honey in the cellar, prayers muttered over broth. The empire can't burn what it can't recognize. In the Andes, Quechua women still chew coca leaves to ease altitude sickness, a practice condemned for centuries by the same institutions that later synthesized its active ingredient into cocaine and sold it back to the world. In rural Europe, witches were often midwives with impeccable knowledge of botany and hygiene. When the witch trials ended, the medicine stayed, only now it was renamed home remedy. Across Africa, healers known for tracking diseases in the body through touch and rhythm passed on their knowledge orally, refusing to let it be reduced to charts or Latin words. The silence wasn't ignorance, it was strategy. In societies where the written word belonged to the conquerors, the smartest response was to keep wisdom unwritten. Plants, after all, don't need peer review. Oral tradition preserved not just the methods, but the worldview that made them work. The sense that illness wasn't a malfunction, but a misalignment. That healing wasn't mechanical but moral, relational, ecological. It's hard not to laugh, a little darkly, at how modern science now discovers mindfulness or integrative medicine, as if inventing empathy were a novel concept. The truth is, medicine only became cold when it lost its storytellers. The old healers never separated narrative from remedy. Every cure came with a story of where the plant grew, which spirit guarded it, how it should be harvested, and why it must be thanked. The story itself was part of the healing, a way of reminding the body it belonged to something larger than itself. What's tragic, and almost beautiful, is how much of that survived without recognition. The same lullaby used to soothe a feverish child 500 years ago still hums in some dark kitchen tonight. The same soup recipe prescribed for weakness still simmers somewhere in a dented pot. Modernity can digitize everything except tenderness. Anthropologists sometimes refer to this phenomenon as subaltern knowledge. Persistence, the quiet endurance of what official history tried to delete, but you don't need a degree to spot it. It's in the mint leaves your grandmother insisted on for stomach pain, in the saltwater rinse for sore throats, in the way every culture still instinctively touches the place that hurts. The body remembers what the books forgot. And just as silence kept that knowledge alive, it also made it invisible. Western medicine mistook the absence of publication for absence of intelligence. What it couldn't categorize, it condescended to. That blind spot, ironically, became the womb of continuity. Because while the world was busy worshipping progress, the real archive stayed alive in whispers, in gardens, and in hands that still knew how to make pain behave with nothing but warmth, herbs, and faith. And when those whispers finally began to surface again, they did so into a world that didn't quite know what to do with them. A world obsessed with authority, allergic to intuition, and terrified of anything that smelled like witchcraft. Which is precisely where the next chapter begins. Nothing makes modern civilization more nervous than something that works but can't be explained. The West has always had a complicated relationship with mystery. It wants to own it, label it, and preferably sterilize it. And when that fails, it calls it superstition. The easiest way to disarm a rival idea is to ridicule it, preferably while taking notes for later use. During the Enlightenment, Europe decided it was done with magic, which would have been admirable, if not for the small detail that most of what it called magic was just medicine without Latin grammar. Midwives, herbalists, bone setters, people who had been patching up humanity for millennia suddenly became public enemies. Healing outside the approved institutions wasn't just frowned upon, it was criminal. The witch hunts weren't only about religion or fear, they were about monopoly. A war between two models of truth, one local and embodied, the other institutional and male. By the 19th century, medicine had turned into a gated community. To heal legally, you needed a license. To get a license, you needed education. And to get education, you needed money and the right gender. Everyone else, the healers, the wise women, the midwives, were recast as relics of a darker age. Their practice survived in secret, disguised as charity or household wisdom. The irony is exquisite. Modern medicine, while preaching rationality, depended entirely on the knowledge it had just outlawed. It's not that science was malicious, it was insecure. The laboratory was a young institution trying to prove itself in a world that still trusted the smell of herbs more than the sound of Latin. To gain legitimacy, it needed a villain, and folk medicine played the part beautifully. The result was a century of medical propaganda portraying healers as lunatics, stirring cauldrons, when in reality they were doing rudimentary epidemiology with fewer dead patients. Even the word quack comes from this era, convenient insult for anyone healing outside the sanctioned model. But quackery often meant innovation before the textbooks caught up. Leeches, bloodletting, and mercury were all once considered modern. Garlic and clay were primitive. Today, the roles have politely reversed. History doesn't like to admit it, but modern medicine evolved by cannibalizing what it mocked. The policing of legitimacy didn't stop with the witch trials. It continued through colonial medicine, when European doctors arrived in Africa, Asia, and the Americas convinced they were bringing hygiene to the heathens. In reality, they were dismantling centuries of localized health systems that understood environment, diet, and spiritual ecology in ways no foreign physician could replicate. Western medicine didn't just replace indigenous healing, it rebranded it as pathology. What's most absurd is how this fear of the non-modern lingers even now. Alternative medicine is tolerated but rarely respected, studied but seldom credited. The moment an herb passes a double-blind trial, it stops being traditional and becomes pharmacological. Success, it seems, is the price of legitimacy. Once the lab approves it, the culture that discovered it disappears from the story. Anthropologists describe this as epistemic hygiene, the systematic scrubbing of context to make knowledge acceptable to the modern mind. It's the intellectual equivalent of bleaching ancient linen until only the label remains. The West doesn't hate mystery, it just wants it to behave. And yet, beneath the polished surfaces of hospitals and universities, that older unease persists, the quiet suspicion that the world is still more complicated than the microscope admits. Every sterile corridor echoes faintly with the chants of those it tried to silence. Because no matter how many degrees hang on the wall, the human instinct to heal doesn't belong to the modern, it belongs to the living. And living things, as history keeps proving, have a habit of remembering. Every civilization has its libraries. Some are made of paper, others of soil. When the forests were alive, they were the shelves of humanity's oldest medical archive. Every bark, leaf, and root was an entry cross-referenced by smell, texture, and season. But archives burned easily, and ours went up in smoke, disguised as progress. The story of losing medicinal knowledge isn't just cultural, it's ecological. Once the land changes, the memory goes with it. The deforestation that built empires also dismantled pharmacopoeias. The same hands that felled trees for trade unknowingly erased cures that had no written names. You can't rebuild a library when you've paved the alphabet. Anthropologists sometimes call this botanical amnesia, the moment when a culture forgets not because it chooses to, but because the ecosystem it depended on no longer exists. The destruction of a plant species often meant the quiet extinction of a language, a ritual, or a healing practice tied to it. It wasn't just loss of biodiversity, it was loss of coherence. The rainforest didn't only regulate the planet's lungs, it organized humanity's memory. The irony is that modernization promised abundance but delivered scarcity of the most intricate kind, scarcity of wisdom. Take the Amazon, for instance. In the early 20th century, over half the known medicinal plants there were used by indigenous groups who could identify their properties by sight and smell. Today, large swaths of that forest have been cleared for soy, cattle, and timber, and with every cleared acre, 1,000 years of biochemical experimentation vanish. When scientists return to study traditional knowledge, they're often studying ghosts. The same happened in Europe long before. The witch hunts, the enclosures, the industrial plough, they erased the old commons where healing herbs grew freely. Monasteries once kept herb gardens as spiritual laboratories, blending theology and botany. When industrial agriculture arrived, those gardens became ornamental lawns. Somewhere between the rosebush and the parking lot, medicine forgot its dirt. Even in deserts and tundras, the pattern repeats. The loss of nomadic roots in North Africa, the displacement of Arctic reindeer herders, the draining of wetlands all carried their own pharmacopoeias into oblivion. Knowledge, it turns out, has roots as literal as any plant. Once you sever them, all that's left is folklore without ingredients. But the truly chilling part of this story isn't extinction, it's substitution. When the wild plants disappeared, the market offered pills. When the healers vanished, advertisements replaced them. Modernity didn't cure the world, it outsourced it. We traded ecological intimacy for global supply chains and called it efficiency. And yet, despite the damage, the earth remains stubbornly generous. Every now and then, a plant reappears, an herb thought lost, sprouting in the cracks of abandoned roads, reminding us that memory, like nature, doesn't go quietly. Some ethnobotanists call these species refuge plants. They survive in forgotten corners, cemeteries, ruins, roadside ditches, teeny rebels against oblivion. They are the Earth's version of resistance literature. Still, the connection between knowledge and landscape is fragile. When people lose access to the land, they lose access to knowing themselves as part of it. Healing stops being relational and becomes transactional. The patients stop seeing the forest as medicine and start seeing it as scenery. And so, the ecology of forgetting continues not just in the forests being logged, but in the cities being built over them. We forget that our immune systems were once apprentices of the land. We forget that soil microbes taught our ancestors how to fight disease long before any vaccine did. But forgetting is rarely permanent. The seeds of memory survive underground, waiting for the right conditions to bloom again. And when they do, they often return in unlikely places: universities, research labs, and collaborative projects where science begins, almost sheepishly, to ask the earth what it already knows. After centuries of ridicule, suppression, and theft, the healer came back not through mysticism, but through research grants. Laboratories, once temples of skepticism, began turning their microscopes toward the same leaves their ancestors had burned as witchcraft. The rediscovery didn't arrive with trumpets. It arrived with funding, and slowly, almost shyly, the language of science started to sound a lot like the language of ritual again. The shift began when ethnobotanists realized that indigenous healers weren't primitive pharmacologists. They were data scientists, working without spreadsheets. Their experiments spanned centuries, not semesters. They didn't test compounds in controlled environments, they tested them on the unpredictable laboratory of life. And they remembered results the way nature intended, orally, rhythmically, communally. In the 1990s, Western medicine finally decided to listen. Pharmaceutical teams began partnering well, claiming to partner with indigenous communities to study their traditional cures. The goal was noble on paper, to merge ancestral wisdom with modern validation. In practice, it often looked like history replaying itself with better Wi-Fi. Healers were interviewed, samples were taken, and compounds were synthesized in cities thousands of miles away. Once again, the plants gained Latin names, and the people lost theirs. Yet not all stories followed the same script. In some corners of the world, genuine collaboration took root. Projects in Kenya, Peru, and the Philippines created hybrid research centers, where scientists and traditional practitioners worked side by side, lab coats beside bead necklaces, microscopes beside mortars and pestles. The results were remarkable not because they invented new cures, but because they restored old relationships. Healing, once exiled from legitimacy, was coming home wearing both a stethoscope and a necklace of seeds. Anthropologists started calling this movement biocultural restitution. It's a fancy way of saying the obvious, that the world needs both chemistry and ceremony to stay alive. The most effective medicine doesn't separate molecule from meaning. It recognizes that the body responds to both. The healer's chant calms the nervous system. The herb calms the inflammation. One prepares the other. It was never science versus spirituality. It was always science plus context. Still, the modern world has a strange way of welcoming what it once exiled. Yoga became boutique, meditation became productivity training, and herbal medicine became boutique supplements, sold with fonts named after mountain ranges. But amid the commodification, a quieter revolution brews. community herbalism, ethnopharmacology programs, integrative clinics that quote both PubMed and Proverbs. The healer is returning not as folklore, but as collaborator. The most profound transformation, though, is in tone. Science, once so certain, now speaks with a little humility. It admits that double-blind trials can't measure everything, that healing involves forces harder to quantify: belief, trust, environment, grief. Medicine is rediscovering what anthropology always knew, that knowledge isn't only about knowing, it's about belonging. And in a poetic twist, technology has become the archivist of the old ways. Databases now store thousands of plant remedies, recorded directly from elders who still remember how to coax medicine out of soil. What was once dismissed as superstition is now protected under intellectual property law. It's not perfect justice, but it's at least a shift from extraction to recognition. The healer, once persecuted, now teaches in universities. The botanist, once skeptical, now burns sage in the lab before testing it for antimicrobial properties. It's an odd reunion, half reconciliation, half déjà vu, but perhaps that's how healing always works, slowly, cyclically, with a faint smile at human arrogance, because in the end, the healer never truly left. She just waited for science to tire of its own certainty and remember that knowledge, like medicine, works best when shared. And once you realize that the old knowledge never vanished, only changed costumes, it's hard not to see it everywhere, in what we eat, drink, and swallow daily without noticing, which is where the final chapter begins. The strange thing about ancient medicine is that it never really left it, just learned to hide in our pantries. The ghosts of healers linger in every kitchen drawer, disguised as seasoning. The very things modern life treats as flavor: ginger, mint, garlic, pepper were once the pharmacopoeia of entire civilizations. Civilization didn't abandon its roots, it sautéed them. Take coffee, the elixir of modern productivity, worshipped in paper cups and spreadsheets, was originally a medicinal brew in Sufi monasteries, not for deadlines, but for devotion. Chocolate, too, began as a ritual stimulant among the Maya, consumed before war or prayer. Aspirin, our humble painkiller, still carries the ghost of willow bark, chewed by indigenous peoples and medieval peasants alike. Every modern convenience hides an ancient intention. We didn't invent comfort, we just privatized it. Even mint tea, the world's simplest cure for indigestion, is a fragment of ritual continuity. Egyptians used it in funerary rites. Greeks prescribed it for melancholy. Victorians served it to fainting guests. Humanity's longest clinical trial is the kitchen. Every culture, no matter how conquered or industrialized, preserved a small domestic rebellion, the recipe that still heals. Anthropologists call this phenomenon cultural residue, the survival of ancient practices under new names. But residue feels too accidental. It's more like persistence. Every jar of honey for a sore throat, every chamomile tea before bed, every vinegar rinse for wounds is an act of quiet inheritance. We're not rediscovering these things, we're remembering them through repetition. Modern marketing, of course, has caught on. The same herbs once hung to dry in clay huts now appear in boutique jars labeled artisanal. The same roots sold by herbalists for pennies now command luxury prices in wellness stores. Civilization has a talent for rebranding wisdom as lifestyle. Yet, despite the irony, there's something redemptive about it. Even if the intentions are commercial, the gestures are ancient. The same hands that once gathered medicine are still reaching for it, just through a different kind of packaging. What fascinates anthropologists most is how memory survives embodiment. You don't need to know the myth of turmeric's divine origin to feel its warmth in milk. You don't have to believe in honey's sacred nature to appreciate its calm on a burning throat. The body remembers even when the intellect forgets. Biology has its own nostalgia, and that's the quiet triumph of the old world. It didn't vanish, it adapted. The healer's chants became recipes, the rituals became routines, the sacred groves became spice markets. What looks like forgetfulness is often disguise. Humanity doesn't forget easily. It hides what it can't explain until it finds a new language for it. The modern world is full of these invisible continuities. The pharmacist's pill and the grandmother's soup belong to the same lineage. The scientist in her lab and the woman steeping herbs by candlelight are both participating in the same experiment. The ongoing negotiation between body, nature, and meaning. One uses microscopes, the other memories, but both are trying to remind the body that it wants to live. Perhaps that's what progress really is, not invention, but translation. We keep renaming the same truths until they sound credible again. Ancient remedies were never lost. They just went undercover in plain sight, waiting for us to notice that every act of healing is, and always has been, an act of remembering.